Hey guys, tonight we venture into the grim darkness of the far future with the Night Lords, the VIII Legion Space Marines, the fallen sons of Konrad Curze, who against the Emperor's vision of hope became harbingers of terror and despair. From noble beginnings as Nostramo's dark liberators to their exile as the galaxy's most feared traitor marines, their story is one of justice corrupted into vengeance, of necessity twisted into pure malice. So before we dive into the warp, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're interested in God of War lore, do visit my channel, SPARTAN SLUMBER. I've added the link in the description below. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world as we explore the galaxy's darkest secrets. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Get into your blanket and let's ease into tonight's journey through the stars together. In the blood-stained annals of the Great Crusade, when 20 demigod primarchs led humanity's conquest across the galaxy, there existed one legion whose very name could break the will of entire worlds before a single shot was fired. The Night Lords, the VIII Legion, were not merely space marines. They were the Emperor's own monsters, unleashed when diplomacy failed and conventional warfare proved too costly. Their primarch, Konrad Curze, possessed a gift that was simultaneously divine and damning. He could see the future with absolute clarity, and in every vision he witnessed only darkness, betrayal, and death. Picture this moment. Deep in the undercity of Nostramo, a world trapped in eternal night, a figure moves through shadows that seem to part before him like a living thing. His eyes glow with an inhuman light as he corners a murderer who has just claimed his fifth victim. The criminal raises a blade, confident in the darkness that has always been his ally. But this hunter sees in absolute darkness as clearly as others see in daylight. The predator has become prey, and what happens next will echo across 10,000 years of galactic history. The killer dies slowly, his screams carrying through the undercity tunnels as a warning to every criminal, every corrupt noble, every parasite feeding on human suffering. His flayed corpse will hang from the highest spire for weeks, a message written in blood and terror. This is justice, the hunter tells himself. This is necessity. But the young primarch cannot yet comprehend that he has just taken the first step on a path that will transform him from savior into the galaxy's most feared monster. The Night Lords were never meant to be heroes in the traditional sense. While their brother legions conquered worlds through superior tactics and overwhelming firepower, the VIII Legion conquered through fear itself. They became the darkness that whispered threats in the night, the shadow that made entire populations submit rather than face the alternative. Their methods were effective beyond measure. Worlds would surrender the moment their black ships appeared in orbit, knowing that resistance meant something far worse than death. But efficiency came at a price that even the Emperor of mankind may not have fully understood when he reunited with his lost son. Konrad Curze's gift of foresight showed him every possible future, and in each one he saw his own damnation. He saw the Horus heresy before it began, witnessed his own participation in humanity's greatest betrayal, and knew with absolute certainty that he would become the very evil he had once fought to destroy. Yet here lies the true tragedy of the Night Lords. Unlike the other traitor legions who fell to corruption or ambition, Konrad Curze fell because he believed his visions were inevitable. He became a monster because he was convinced he had no choice. His legion followed him into darkness, not out of malice, but out of loyalty to a father who had shown them that fear could be as powerful a weapon as any bolter or chainsword. Tonight, we will follow their descent from the undercity tunnels of Nostramo to the blood-soaked battlefields of the Horus heresy. We will witness how the Emperor's most effective weapon became his greatest failure, how a tool of justice became an instrument of pure terror. The story of the Night Lords is not just one of corruption and betrayal. It is the story of a prophecy that fulfilled itself, of a man who tried to fight fate and in doing so became everything he feared he would become. But before we understand the monster, we must first understand the world that created him. We must journey to Nostramo, a planet where the sun never shines and darkness reigns eternal. A world where survival meant becoming either predator or prey, where the concept of mercy was as foreign as daylight itself. The tale begins not with the arrival of a Primarch, but with the conditions that would shape him into something the galaxy had never seen before. It begins in a place where nightmares were reality, and reality was a nightmare that never ended. Long before the name Konrad Curze would strike terror into the hearts of billions, long before the VIII Legion would perfect the art of psychological warfare, there existed a world where darkness was not merely the absence of light, but a living thing that shaped every aspect of human existence. Nostramo, the world that would birth the Night Haunter, was a planet trapped in perpetual night, orbiting a dying star whose feeble light never penetrated the dense atmospheric shroud that wrapped around the world like a funeral shroud. Archaeological surveys conducted during the Great Crusade estimated that Nostramo had not seen true daylight for over 15,000 years. The planet's surface existed in a state of eternal twilight at best, with most regions plunged into absolute darkness. This was not the gentle darkness of a natural night cycle, but an oppressive, crushing darkness that seemed to have weight and substance. The atmosphere was thick with industrial pollution and volcanic ash, creating a perpetual overcast that blocked even the stars from view. In this world of endless night, humanity had adapted in ways both subtle and profound. The population had developed enhanced night vision over countless generations, their eyes growing larger and more sensitive to capture what little light existed. Their skin had grown pale to the point of translucency in many cases, and their hearing had become acute enough to navigate by sound alone through the maze of undercity tunnels that honeycomb the planet's surface. But more than physical adaptation, the eternal darkness had shaped the very soul of Nostraman society. In a world where you could not see your neighbor's face, where every shadow might conceal a threat, where the difference between day and night meant nothing, concepts of trust and community had withered like plants deprived of sunlight. What emerged instead was a civilization built on fear, predation, and the absolute rule of those strong enough to take what they wanted from those too weak to stop them. The world's social structure reflected this brutal reality. At the apex of society lived the noble houses in towering spires that reached above the worst of the atmospheric murk. These massive structures, some stretching kilometers into the sky, were marvels of engineering that housed entire dynasties of aristocrats who had accumulated wealth and power over millennia. The spires were illuminated by artificial light sources, creating islands of brightness in an ocean of darkness. Here, the nobility lived lives of decadent luxury, insulated from the horrors of the world below by layers of security, technology, and willful ignorance. The spire dwellers had grown soft over generations of easy living. They were pale even by Nostraman standards, their bodies weak from lack of physical challenge, their minds focused entirely on maintaining their positions through political manipulation and the careful management of their criminal enterprises. For the noble houses of Nostramo were not legitimate rulers in any sense that the greater Imperium would recognize. They were crime families, cartels that had grown so powerful and established that they had taken on the trappings of aristocracy. Each noble house controlled specific aspects of Nostramo's economy through violence and intimidation. House Quintanus dominated the adamantium mines that provided the planet's only significant export. House Kraken controlled the food distribution networks, ensuring that sustenance flowed only to those who could pay their tribute. House Vestia managed the labor guilds, essentially running a planet-wide slavery operation disguised as legitimate employment. Below the spires, in the mid-levels of the great cities, lived the merchant classes and skilled workers who served the nobility. These people existed in a constant state of anxiety, never knowing when they might draw the attention of their betters, or when some minor transgression might see them cast down into the undercity depths. They lived in cramped habitation blocks with minimal lighting, their world a perpetual gray twilight, relieved only by the occasional flicker of failing luminators. The mid-level dwellers had developed their own complex social hierarchies based primarily on their relationships with the various criminal organizations that controlled different aspects of daily life. Protection rackets were not just common but necessary for survival. A merchant who refused to pay tribute to the local gang might find his shop burned, his family murdered, and himself thrown to the depths below. This created a society where corruption was not just tolerated but expected, where honesty was seen as a form of mental illness, and trust was a luxury that could cost you your life. But it was in the undercity depths where Nostraman society showed its true face. Here, in kilometers of tunnels and caverns carved from the living rock, dwelt the vast majority of the planet's population. These were the workers who toiled in the adamantium mines, the factory slaves who processed raw materials for export, the criminals who had fallen from grace in the levels above, and the countless generations of their descendants who had never seen anything but absolute darkness. The Undercity was a maze of interconnected tunnels, abandoned mining shafts, natural caverns, and forgotten industrial complexes. There was no central authority, no law beyond the rule of strength, no mercy for the weak or unfortunate. Gangs fought constant wars over territory, resources, and sometimes for no reason other than boredom and bloodlust. Murder was so common that bodies were simply thrown into the deepest shafts and forgotten. Theft was not just a crime, but a way of life, with entire cultures developing around different approaches to taking from others. The air in the depths was thick with industrial pollution, chemical runoff from the processing plants above, and the stench of human misery concentrated into its purest form. Disease was rampant, with plagues sweeping through entire sections of the Undercity on a regular basis. Medical care was non-existent, except for what the residents could provide for themselves, leading to a population that was simultaneously incredibly hardy and perpetually on the edge of death. Food was scarce in the depths, leading to a thriving black market in everything from processed proteins to actual human flesh. The distinction between scavenger and cannibal had long since blurred beyond recognition. Water came from ancient pipes that leaked industrial runoff as often as anything drinkable, and even that had to be fought for on a daily basis. In this environment, children grew up learning to kill before they learned to read. The concept of childhood innocence was as foreign as sunlight. A 5-year-old who couldn't defend himself was a dead 5-year-old, and the harsh mathematics of survival ensured that only the most cunning, vicious, and adaptable individuals lived to see adulthood. The gangs that controlled the Undercity were not the romanticized criminal organizations found on more civilized worlds. They were packs of human predators bound together by necessity and held in line by fear. Gang leaders maintained control through spectacular displays of violence that would have horrified even hardened Imperial guardsmen. Torture was not just a means of extracting information, but an art form, with different gangs developing signature methods of inflicting pain and terror on their enemies. Yet, even in this hellscape of human degradation, there existed certain unwritten rules that kept society from collapsing entirely into chaos. The strong did not prey on the weak randomly, but according to established hierarchies and territorial boundaries. Certain areas were neutral ground where even enemies could meet safely. Some individuals, usually those who provided essential services, were considered off-limits to gang violence. But these rules were fragile things, maintained only by the fear of mutual destruction. When they broke down, the results were catastrophic. Gang wars would sweep through entire sections of the Undercity like wildfire, leaving thousands dead and whole communities destroyed. The survivors would eventually re-establish order, but always at a lower level, always more brutal than what had come before. The economy of the Undercity was based primarily on violence and exploitation. Protection rackets, slave trading, organ harvesting, and drug manufacturing were the primary industries. The few legitimate businesses that existed did so only because they provided services that the criminals needed. Weaponsmiths, chemical suppliers, and body disposal specialists could make a reasonable living, but always under the protection of one gang or another. What passed for culture in the Undercity was built around the celebration of violence and the worship of those strong enough to take what they wanted. Heroes were those who had killed the most enemies, accumulated the most territory, inspired the most fear. Stories were told of legendary gang leaders who had ruled vast sections of the tunnels, but these tales always ended in betrayal and death, for in the Undercity, no one stayed on top for long. The psychological impact of living in this environment was profound and lasting. Trust was not just rare, but actively harmful to survival. Empathy was a weakness that would get you killed. The ability to inflict pain on others was not just useful, but essential. These were not learned behaviors, but fundamental aspects of character forged in the absolute darkness of a world that knew no mercy. Religion, such as it was, focused on the worship of death and darkness. The few cults that existed celebrated suffering as a purifying force and death as the only true escape from the hell of existence. They did not pray for salvation or redemption, but for the strength to survive another day and the cunning to destroy their enemies. Some of the more organized cults engaged in ritual murder and cannibalism, practices that were seen as eccentric rather than horrifying by the general population. It was into this world of absolute darkness, perpetual violence, and complete moral collapse that something unprecedented would soon arrive. something that would begin as a force for justice and order, but would inevitably be shaped by the very environment it sought to change. The stage was set for the arrival of a being who would try to bring light to a world that had forgotten what light looked like, and in doing so would discover that sometimes the darkness changes you far more than you can change it. The conditions on Nostramo were not merely harsh or challenging. They were designed by fate itself to create something that had never existed before in the galaxy. A world so perfectly suited to forging a master of terror that it seemed as though the dark gods themselves had crafted it for that purpose. The pieces were all in place, the environment perfectly prepared. All that was needed now was the arrival of something extraordinary, something that would take all the world's darkness and violence and cruelty and transform them into weapons that could conquer stars. In the deepest tunnels beneath Nostramo's industrial wasteland, where even the hardened criminals feared to venture, something impossible happened. A gestation pod, one of 20 scattered across the galaxy by the machinations of chaos, crashed through layers of rock and metal to embed itself in an abandoned mining shaft so deep that no living soul had walked its passages for centuries. From this pod emerged an infant unlike any the galaxy had ever seen. Where a normal child would have perished within hours in the toxic atmosphere and absolute darkness of the deep undercity, this being not only survived but thrived. His eyes, even as a newborn, could pierce the impenetrable blackness as clearly as if it were broad daylight. His skin, pale as bleached bone, seemed to absorb and reflect the faintest traces of light. Most unnaturally of all, his mind was already touched by visions of futures yet to come. The infant who would become Konrad Curze possessed no name, no family, no protector, save his own preternatural abilities. He learned to walk by following the scurrying of tunnel rats through passages no adult human could navigate. He learned to hunt by watching how the rats caught smaller prey, how they used darkness as both shield and weapon. His first meal was raw rat flesh, torn from the bone with teeth that were already growing sharp and predatory. As months passed, the child's superhuman nature became increasingly apparent. His growth rate far exceeded that of any normal human, his muscles developing with unnatural speed and density. His senses expanded beyond mere night vision to encompass an almost supernatural awareness of his surroundings. He could hear a heartbeat from hundreds of meters away, smell fear sweat through thick walls, sense the presence of other living beings, even when they believed themselves perfectly hidden. But perhaps most disturbing of all were the visions that plagued him, even as a toddler. In his dreams and waking moments alike, he saw glimpses of possible futures playing out like fragments of some cosmic drama. He witnessed his own hands covered in blood, heard screams that had not yet been uttered, saw faces twisted in terror that belonged to people he had never met. These visions came without warning and without mercy, forcing upon his developing mind the knowledge that he was destined for something far greater and more terrible than simple survival. The first time young Konrad encountered another human being, he was perhaps 3 years old by normal reckoning, though his accelerated development made him appear much older. A scavenger had ventured deeper than usual into the abandoned tunnels, drawn by rumors of valuable salvage in the deepest shafts. The man carried a failing luminator that cast weak shadows dancing across the tunnel walls. The child watched this intruder from the darkness, studying the man's movements, learning from his behavior. He observed how the scavenger jumped at every sound, how his breathing quickened when the light flickered, how his eyes darted constantly from shadow to shadow, seeking threats. In that moment, young Konrad learned his first lesson about human nature and the power of fear. This adult, fully grown and armed, was terrified of the very darkness that had become the child's home and ally. When the scavenger's light finally failed, his panic was immediate and overwhelming. He began calling out, his voice echoing through the tunnels in desperate pleas for help that would never come. It was then that the child chose to reveal himself, stepping into the man's path with movements so silent that he seemed to materialize from the darkness itself. The scavenger's terror was absolute. He saw what appeared to be a pale specter with glowing eyes emerging from the black depths, and his mind simply could not process what he was witnessing. His screams echoed through the tunnels until his heart simply stopped from the shock. Young Konrad studied the corpse with scientific curiosity, understanding instinctively that he had just discovered something more powerful than any physical weapon. Fear itself could kill. Over the following years, similar encounters became more frequent as the growing child's territory expanded and his confidence increased. Criminals fleeing deeper into the tunnels to escape gang warfare above would occasionally stumble into his domain, and none ever left to tell of what they found there. Word began to spread through the Undercity of something unnatural lurking in the deepest passages, a pale death that stalked the tunnels where even hardened killers feared to go. As Konrad reached what would have been adolescence for a normal human, his understanding of justice began to take shape. Through careful observation of the criminal underworld above his domain, he witnessed countless acts of cruelty, exploitation, and murder. He saw the strong prey upon the weak, not out of necessity, but from pure malice. He watched children starve while gang leaders feasted, saw innocents tortured for entertainment, witnessed the systematic degradation of anything resembling hope or decency. But more than witnessing these crimes, he began to understand their patterns. His visions showed him not just what was happening, but what would happen if these patterns continued unchecked. He saw Nostramo's descent into ever greater depths of depravity, watched entire populations consumed by their own evil, witnessed the planet becoming a monument to human corruption that would spread its poison to other worlds. It was during this period that the being who had once been a nameless foundling began to think of himself as the Night Haunter. The name came to him in visions, whispered by voices he could not identify, but somehow trusted. He was the hunter who stalked the darkness, the predator who would prey upon predators, the force that would restore balance to a world that had forgotten what balance looked like. His first deliberate act of justice came when he was perhaps 10 years old in actual age, but already possessing the physical development and mental acuity of an adult human. A gang of slavers had established a temporary base in one of the upper levels of his territory, using captured children as both labor and entertainment. Their screams had echoed down through the tunnel system for days, and each cry of pain had triggered visions in Konrad's mind of futures where such suffering was multiplied across entire star systems. The Night Haunter's assault on the slaver base was not merely an attack, but a carefully orchestrated psychological campaign. He began by picking off sentries one by one, leaving their bodies arranged in increasingly elaborate displays designed to maximize the terror of those who discovered them. He used the tunnel system to appear and disappear at will, striking without warning and vanishing before the slavers could mount any effective response. But it was not enough simply to kill these criminals. The Night Haunter had learned from his visions that death alone was insufficient to deter others from similar crimes. What was needed was an example so terrifying, so utterly horrifying, that the memory of it would spread throughout the underworld and prevent future atrocities through pure fear. The slaver leader's death took 3 days. The Night Haunter kept him alive through careful application of pain and medical knowledge that seemed to come from nowhere, forcing the man to experience every variety of suffering he had inflicted upon his victims. The screams that echoed through the tunnels during those 72 hours were unlike anything the Undercity had ever heard, so filled with anguish and terror that even hardened criminals fled the area rather than risk discovering their source. When the Night Haunter finally allowed the slaver leader to die, he flayed the corpse and hung the skin from the tunnel entrance like a banner. The remaining gang members, driven mad by days of psychological torture, were released to spread word of what they had witnessed. Their garbled accounts of a pale demon who could appear from nowhere, who knew their crimes before they committed them, who could inflict suffering beyond imagination, became the foundation of a legend that would reshape Nostramo's criminal underworld. Word of the Night Haunter began to spread through the Undercity like wildfire. At first, the stories were dismissed as the ravings of traumatized minds or elaborate hoaxes designed to claim territory through intimidation. But as more gangs ventured into the deep tunnels and failed to return, as more mutilated corpses appeared in public spaces with messages carved into their flesh, the criminal classes began to realize that something unprecedented was stalking them from the darkness. The Night Haunter's methods evolved with each subsequent action. He learned to use fear as both weapon and tool, understanding that the threat of his presence was often more effective than his actual intervention. Criminals began policing their own behavior out of terror that they might draw his attention. Gang leaders implemented strict codes of conduct, not out of morality, but from pure survival instinct. But perhaps most significantly, the young Primarch began to understand that his gifts extended far beyond enhanced physical abilities and prophetic visions. He possessed an intuitive understanding of human psychology that allowed him to craft terror campaigns of unprecedented sophistication. He could predict how news of his actions would spread, how different individuals would react to specific types of fear, how to use the criminal underworld's own communication networks to amplify his reputation far beyond what his actual presence could achieve. The transformation from abandoned infant to master of psychological warfare had taken less than a decade, but its effects would reshape not just Nostramo, but eventually entire sectors of the galaxy. The Night Haunter had learned to weaponize darkness itself, to turn the very environment that had forged him into an instrument of justice that operated according to rules no previous authority had dared to enforce. Yet even as his campaign of terror began to show results in the deep Undercity, Konrad's visions continued to show him glimpses of futures that filled him with dread. He saw himself not as the savior of Nostramo, but as something far more terrible. He witnessed his own transformation from deliverer of justice into an agent of pure malice, watched himself commit atrocities that would make his current methods seem merciful by comparison. These visions should have warned him away from the path he was choosing. Instead, they only convinced him that such a fate was inevitable, that he was doomed to become the very evil he sought to destroy. This fatalistic acceptance of his own damnation would prove to be the foundation upon which his future corruption would build, the seed from which the galaxy's most feared monsters would eventually grow. The Night Haunter's reputation had grown beyond the confines of the deep Undercity, spreading through criminal networks like a virus of pure terror. Gang leaders who had never feared anything in their brutal lives now looked over their shoulders constantly, seeing threats in every shadow. The very mention of his name became taboo among the superstitious criminals, as if speaking it might somehow draw his attention. But Konrad Curze had begun to understand that his mission extended far beyond punishing individual criminals in the tunnels beneath Nostramo. His visions showed him the true scope of corruption that had infected his world, reaching from the deepest gang hideouts all the way up to the gleaming spires where the noble houses conducted their affairs in luxury built upon the suffering of billions. The entire planet was a cancer that required not treatment but complete surgical removal of its diseased elements. His first major emergence into the mid-levels of Nostraman society came during what the criminal underworld called the Night of Falling Stars. A massive gang war had erupted over control of several key smuggling routes, and the violence had spilled over into civilian areas where innocent families cowered in their hab blocks while killers fought pitched battles in the corridors outside their homes. The Night Haunter descended upon this chaos like an avenging angel of darkness. But rather than simply eliminating the combatants, he orchestrated a campaign of psychological warfare that would fundamentally alter how criminals operated on Nostramo. He began by kidnapping the leaders of both warring factions, not to kill them immediately, but to subject them to experiences that would break their minds and turn them into unwilling agents of his will. For 72 hours, these gang lords disappeared completely from Nostramo. Their lieutenants searched frantically. Their armies ceased fighting to focus on finding their missing commanders. When the leaders finally reappeared, they were fundamentally changed beings. They spoke in whispers of a pale figure who had shown them visions of their own deaths played out in excruciating detail, who had made them witness every atrocity they had committed from the perspective of their victims, who had forced them to confront the inevitable consequences of their actions, not just for themselves, but for everyone they claimed to care about. Both gang leaders immediately disbanded their organizations, ordered their soldiers to abandon their criminal activities, and retreated into hiding, where they would spend the remainder of their lives as broken shells of their former selves. The sudden end to the gang war shocked the criminal underworld and sent waves of terror through every illegal operation on the planet. If the Night Haunter could reach the most powerful crime lords in their heavily fortified strongholds, then no one was safe from his justice. But this was only the beginning of Konrad's campaign to cleanse Nostramo of its corruption. His visions had shown him that the criminal gangs were merely symptoms of a deeper disease, puppets dancing to strings pulled by the noble houses in their gleaming spires high above. These aristocratic families had grown rich and powerful by encouraging and exploiting the chaos below, profiting from slavery, murder, and every form of human degradation while maintaining the pretense of civilized society. The Night Haunter's assault on the nobility began not with violence, but with information warfare. Using his supernatural abilities to infiltrate even the most secure locations, he began gathering evidence of the noble house's crimes. He documented their slave trading operations, their drug manufacturing facilities, their systematic exploitation of the working classes. More importantly, he began to understand the complex web of corruption that connected every level of Nostraman society in one vast criminal enterprise. His first target among the nobility was House Vestia, whose control of the labor guilds had made them responsible for more human suffering than any single organization in Nostramo's history. The head of House Vestia was Lord Castellan Marcus Vestia, a man whose cruelty was legendary even among the jaded aristocracy. Marcus had made his fortune by purchasing criminals from the undercity gangs and working them to death in his mining operations, then selling their organs on the black market to recoup his investment. The Night Haunters' campaign against House Vestia began with a series of targeted assassinations designed to dismantle the house's power structure from within. But these were not simple murders. Each death was crafted to send a specific message, not just to House Vestia, but to all the noble families who had grown comfortable in their belief that their wealth and position placed them beyond the reach of justice. Marcus Vestia's personal bodyguard, a cyber-enhanced killer named Vex Korath, was found hanging upside down from the family's private chapel, his augmetic limbs removed and arranged around his corpse in a pattern that spelled out his crimes against the innocent. The house's financial administrator, responsible for laundering the profits from slave labor, was discovered in his sealed office, with every bone in his body broken in a specific sequence that corresponded to the deaths he had caused through his calculations. Each assassination was accompanied by detailed documentation of the victims' crimes, carved into their flesh with surgical precision, and left for the authorities to discover. The Night Haunter wanted there to be no question about why these people had died, no possibility that their deaths could be dismissed as random violence or gang activity. This was justice being served according to a moral code that transcended the corrupt laws of Nostraman society. The psychological impact on the remaining members of House Vestia was immediate and profound. Lord Marcus began to suffer from terrible nightmares in which he was hunted through endless dark corridors by a pale figure whose eyes burned with righteous fury. His family members started seeing shadows that moved independently of their sources, hearing whispers in empty rooms, finding evidence that someone had been in their private chambers despite supposedly impregnable security. The breaking point came when Marcus discovered that the Night Haunter had somehow gained access to his personal records, not just his business dealings, but his most private thoughts and fears, documented in journals he had kept since childhood. Pages from these journals began appearing throughout the spire, posted in public spaces where anyone could read about the young nobleman's progression from innocent child to conscienceless monster. Faced with the complete destruction of his reputation, and the certainty that the Night Haunter would eventually come for him personally, Marcus Vestia did something unprecedented in the history of Nostramo's nobility. He publicly confessed to his crimes, dissolved House Vestia's criminal operations, and used his family's fortune to provide compensation to the victims of his labor camps. Then, in an act that shocked the aristocracy to its core, he threw himself from the highest tower of his spire, rather than face whatever fate the Night Haunter might have planned for him. The death of Marcus Vestia and the complete capitulation of one of Nostramo's most powerful houses sent shockwaves throughout the planet's power structure. For the first time in millennia, the noble families understood that their position did not grant them immunity from consequences. The Night Haunter had proven that no fortress was impregnable, no security system was perfect, and no amount of wealth could purchase safety from true justice. But rather than uniting against this common threat, the surviving noble houses began to turn on each other in paranoia and fear. Each family suspected the others of somehow working with or harboring the Night Haunter. Alliances that had endured for centuries crumbled as houses began investigating each other's activities, desperately searching for evidence of crimes that might draw the pale ghost's attention. The Night Haunter exploited this paranoia masterfully, feeding carefully crafted intelligence to different houses that implicated their rivals in various atrocities. He watched with satisfaction as the aristocracy tore itself apart from within, eliminating each other more efficiently than he could have managed alone. This was psychological warfare, elevated to the level of high art, using the nobility's own greed and paranoia as weapons against them. Within months, the power structure that had controlled Nostramo for thousands of years had largely collapsed. Some houses had destroyed themselves through internal conflicts, others had fled the planet entirely, and the few that remained had dramatically reformed their operations to avoid drawing the Night Haunter's wrath. The systematic exploitation that had defined Nostraman society for millennia was being replaced by something resembling actual order. But this transformation came at a cost that even Konrad himself had not fully anticipated. As the noble houses fell and the criminal gangs disbanded, a power vacuum emerged that needed to be filled. The common people of Nostramo, freed from their oppressors but lacking any experience with self-governance, looked to the Night Haunter as their savior and natural ruler. Konrad found himself reluctantly assuming the role of planetary governor, a position he accepted not from ambition but from necessity. His visions showed him that without strong leadership, Nostramo would descend into chaos even worse than what had come before. The planet needed someone who could maintain order, and the Night Haunter was the only authority that every citizen, from the deepest tunnels to the highest spires, both respected and feared. Under his rule, crime on Nostramo virtually disappeared overnight. The mere possibility that the Night Haunter might be watching was enough to deter even minor infractions. Citizens policed themselves with a dedication that bordered on fanaticism, knowing that any transgression might draw the attention of the pale figure who ruled from the shadows. Public spaces became safe for the first time in living memory. Children could walk the streets without fear, and honest work became both possible and profitable. Yet even as he achieved what no previous ruler of Nostramo had managed, Konrad remained tormented by visions of what this apparent paradise would eventually become. He saw his methods growing ever more extreme, watched himself transform from protector into tyrant, witnessed the people's love turn to terror and their gratitude become desperate submission. The very success of his campaign to bring justice to Nostramo had set in motion forces that would eventually corrupt everything he had fought to achieve. Most disturbing of all, his visions began to show him glimpses of a larger destiny that awaited him beyond Nostramo's borders. He saw vast fleets of warships bearing his symbol, witnessed worlds burning under the assault of warriors who fought in his name, and heard the screams of billions who would die because of orders he would someday give. The Night Haunter had succeeded in bringing peace to one world, but in doing so, he had proven himself capable of bringing war to the entire galaxy. The day the Emperor of Mankind set foot upon Nostramo marked the end of one era and the beginning of another that would reshape the galaxy itself. His arrival was preceded by omens that the planet's newly ordered population interpreted with a mixture of awe and terror. The perpetual overcast that had shrouded their world for millennia began to thin, allowing actual sunlight to penetrate the atmosphere for the first time in generations. Citizens who had never seen natural light emerged from their hab-blocks to witness this miracle, many weeping at the beauty of something their ancestors had described only in half-remembered legends. But for Konrad Curze, the Emperor's arrival was both vindication and condemnation rolled into one overwhelming experience. His visions had shown him fragments of this moment countless times, but experiencing it in reality was something altogether different. Standing before the master of mankind, Konrad felt the full weight of his heritage pressing down upon him like a physical force. He was a Primarch, one of 20 demigods created to lead humanity's conquest of the stars, and yet his first instinct upon meeting his father was not joy or pride, but a terrible certainty that this reunion would ultimately lead to catastrophe. The Emperor studied his lost son with eyes that seemed to penetrate directly into his soul, seeing not just what Konrad had become, but what he was destined to become. There was recognition there, and perhaps disappointment, but also something that might have been sorrow. The Master of Mankind had created 20 perfect beings to serve as his generals in the Great Crusade, but perfection, he was learning, was a more complex concept than even his vast intellect had fully grasped. Their first conversation took place in the ruins of what had once been House Quintanus's primary fortress, now a monument to the Night Haunters' campaign against the aristocracy. Konrad had chosen this location deliberately, wanting his father to understand that his methods, however extreme, had achieved results that more conventional approaches had failed to accomplish for thousands of years. Nostramo was peaceful, prosperous, and united under his rule in ways that its previous governors could never have imagined. Yet the Emperor's reaction to this achievement was not the approval Konrad had expected. Instead, there was concern in his father's expression as he examined the evidence of his son's reign. The streets were indeed safe, but they were also empty of the spontaneous joy and life that characterized truly healthy societies. The citizens were orderly and productive, but their efficiency came from fear rather than genuine civic virtue. This was not the enlightened civilization the Emperor sought to create, but rather a more sophisticated form of tyranny. When the Emperor finally spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute authority tempered by paternal concern. He acknowledged that Konrad had accomplished the impossible by bringing order to a world that had seemed beyond redemption, but he also made it clear that the methods employed were problematic for the larger goals of the Great Crusade. Humanity needed to be uplifted and inspired, not merely cowed into submission through terror. But rather than condemning his son outright, the Emperor offered him something unprecedented, a chance to channel his abilities in service of a greater cause. The VIII Legion of Space Marines had been waiting for their Primarch's return, and they would provide Konrad with the tools necessary to refine his approach to governance and warfare. Instead of ruling through fear alone, he could learn to balance terror with genuine justice, using his gifts to protect humanity rather than simply controlling it. The meeting with the VIII Legion was a revelation for Konrad in ways he had not anticipated. These Terran-born Space Marines had been fighting across the galaxy for decades under different commanders, developing their own traditions and combat doctrines in the absence of their primogenitor. They were warriors of exceptional skill and dedication, but they lacked the focused purpose that only their genetic father could provide. The Legion's senior officers, veterans of countless campaigns across the galaxy, initially regarded their new primarch with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. They had heard reports of his conquest of Nostramo, but the methods he had employed were unlike anything in their experience. Space Marines were created to be humanity's protectors and liberators, not its oppressors, and some questioned whether the Night Haunter's approach was compatible with their mission. Captain Jago Sevatarian, who would eventually become the Legion's first captain and Konrad's most trusted lieutenant, was among the first to recognize the potential in his Primarch's methods. Sevatarian understood that warfare was ultimately about breaking the enemy's will to resist, and the Night Haunter had developed techniques for accomplishing this that were far more sophisticated than simple battlefield superiority. The question was not whether these methods were effective, but whether they could be applied in ways that served the Emperor's vision for humanity's future. The integration of Nostramo recruits into the VIII Legion created a unique military organization that combined the disciplined professionalism of the Terran Marines with the ruthless cunning of Nostramo's survivors. The planet's population, shaped by generations of violence and hardship, produced recruits who possessed an instinctive understanding of psychological warfare that complemented the Space Marines' physical capabilities perfectly. Under Konrad's guidance, the VIII Legion developed tactical doctrines that emphasized terror as both weapon and tool. They learned to use fear not merely to demoralize enemies, but to prevent conflicts entirely, arriving at hostile worlds with reputations so terrifying that surrender became preferable to resistance. This approach proved remarkably effective during the early years of Konrad's service to the Great Crusade, with the VIII Legion achieving compliance rates that exceeded those of most other forces. The Legion's organization reflected its Primarch's strategic philosophy, with companies specializing in different aspects of psychological warfare. Some focused on infiltration and assassination, removing key leadership figures before major battles began. Others specialized in terror raids designed to break enemy morale through spectacular displays of violence. Still others became experts in siege warfare, using fear tactics to convince defenders that resistance was futile. But perhaps most importantly, the VIII Legion developed a sophisticated intelligence network that allowed them to identify the specific fears and psychological vulnerabilities of different enemy cultures. They studied their targets' histories, religions, and social structures to craft terror campaigns that would be most effective against particular populations. This approach required a level of strategic thinking and cultural analysis that went far beyond conventional military planning. The Legion's equipment and heraldry evolved to reflect their role as the Emperor's instruments of terror. Their power armor was painted in midnight blue, so dark it appeared black in most lighting conditions, with lightning bolt decorations that seemed to flicker and move in the shadows. Their helmets were crafted to resemble skulls or death masks, designed to be the last thing an enemy would see before death. Even their weapons were modified to maximize psychological impact, with chainswords that screamed when activated, and bolters that produced distinctive muzzle flashes, designed to create fear in enemy ranks. The VIII Legion's fortress monastery on Nostramo became a monument to disciplined terror, its architecture designed to inspire both awe and dread in equal measure. The structure rose from the planet's surface like a Gothic cathedral dedicated to the worship of fear itself, with spires that disappeared into the perpetual clouds and chambers that echoed with the sounds of training exercises that bordered on torture. This was not merely a military installation, but a temple where the art of psychological warfare was elevated to religious significance. During these golden years of the VIII Legion's existence, Konrad himself seemed to achieve a balance between his darker impulses and his genuine desire to serve humanity's greater good. His visions still tormented him with glimpses of future atrocities, but he began to believe that these were merely possible futures that could be avoided through careful choices and constant vigilance. Working alongside his brother Primarchs and serving the Emperor's cause gave him purpose beyond simple domination, a sense that his abilities could be used constructively rather than merely destructively. The Great Crusade provided the perfect outlet for the Night Haunter's talents, offering him a seemingly endless supply of genuinely evil enemies who deserved the full measure of his terrible justice. Orc warlords who enslaved human populations, dark Eldar raiders who tortured innocents for entertainment, and chaos cults that sought to damn entire worlds found themselves facing retribution so complete and horrifying that their allies would surrender rather than risk similar fates. Yet even during these years of apparent success and integration, there were signs that all was not well with the VIII Legion and its Primarch. Konrad's visions grew more frequent and more disturbing, showing him not just his own future corruption, but the eventual fate of his entire legion. He began to see glimpses of the Horus heresy before it began, understanding that the Great Crusade would end in civil war, and that he would play a crucial role in humanity's greatest disaster. These prophetic glimpses created a growing sense of fatalism in Konrad that began to influence his decisions and his treatment of his subordinates. If he was destined to become a monster, he reasoned, then perhaps his current restraint was merely delaying the inevitable. The careful balance he had achieved between terror and justice began to shift as he started to embrace more extreme methods, justifying them as necessary preparations for the dark times ahead. The VIII Legion's recruiting practices also began to change during this period, with an increasing emphasis on candidates who possessed the specific psychological traits that would be necessary for the campaigns to come. The Legion started to actively seek out individuals who had survived extreme trauma, who understood violence intimately, who could inflict suffering without being broken by the experience themselves. This gradual shift in recruitment standards would eventually poison the Legion's culture from within. Most significantly, Konrad began to distance himself emotionally from both his father and his brother Primarchs, convinced that his visions of future betrayal made genuine relationships impossible. He started to view his participation in the Great Crusade not as a chance for redemption, but as an elaborate performance designed to maintain appearances until his true nature could be safely revealed. This psychological isolation would prove to be the foundation upon which his eventual corruption would build. The early decades of the Great Crusade witnessed the VIII Legion's transformation into one of the most effective and feared military forces in human history. Under Konrad Curze's leadership, they had developed a form of warfare that transcended traditional concepts of victory and defeat, creating a strategic doctrine based on the principle that the enemy's surrender was infinitely preferable to their destruction. This philosophy would prove both their greatest strength and the source of their eventual damnation. The Legion's first major campaign beyond Nostramo took them to the Sheral system, where a confederation of human worlds had fallen under the influence of a particularly vicious xeno-species known as the lacrimole. These creatures were parasites in the truest sense, feeding not on flesh or blood, but on human suffering itself, cultivating entire populations as farms for their psychic sustenance. The worlds under their control had become laboratories of torment, where billions of humans existed in states of constant agony, designed to maximize the emotional harvest their alien overlords required. Traditional Imperial doctrine would have called for a straightforward military assault, liberating the human populations through superior firepower and tactical excellence. But Konrad Curze understood that such an approach, while ultimately successful, would result in massive casualties among the very people the Crusades sought to save. The lacrimole would use their human subjects as shields, forcing Imperial forces to kill millions of innocents to reach their actual enemies. Instead, the Night Haunter orchestrated a campaign of psychological warfare that turned the aliens' own methods against them. The VIII Legion began by infiltrating the lacrimole feeding facilities, not to destroy them but to document in excruciating detail the horrors being perpetrated within. These recordings were then broadcast throughout the system, ensuring that every human on every world understood exactly what their alien masters were doing to their fellow citizens. But mere documentation was insufficient for Konrad's purposes. The Night Lords began systematically hunting down individual lacrimole, subjecting them to the same tortures they had inflicted upon their human victims. However, where the aliens had sought to maximize suffering for its own sake, the VIII Legion's actions served a specific strategic purpose. Each captured lacrimole was kept alive just long enough to broadcast their agony back to their fellow creatures, demonstrating that their apparent invincibility was an illusion. The psychological impact on the lacrimole was immediate and profound. These beings had spent centuries cultivating an image of themselves as superior predators who existed beyond the reach of human retribution. The sudden reversal of this dynamic, the realization that they had become prey in their own hunting grounds, shattered their confidence and unity. Within months, the alien confederation began to collapse as different factions turned on each other in paranoid desperation. More importantly, the human populations under lacrimole control began to see the VIII Legion not as conquerors, but as liberators who understood the nature of their suffering. The Night Lords' reputation for brutality, which might have terrified ordinary civilians, instead inspired hope among people who had experienced horrors that made even the Space Marines' methods seem merciful by comparison. When the final assault came, the human populations actively assisted the Imperial forces, providing intelligence and sabotage that made the campaign's conclusion swift and decisive. The Sheral system's liberation established a pattern that would define the VIII Legion's approach to warfare. Throughout the Great Crusade, they became specialists in campaigns where traditional military methods were insufficient, where the enemy's cruelty or the strategic situation demanded responses that other legions could not or would not provide. Word of their effectiveness spread throughout the Imperial hierarchy, making them the force of choice for the Crusades' most difficult and morally ambiguous operations. But this specialization came at a cost that would not become apparent until much later. The VIII Legion was increasingly called upon to confront the galaxy's worst monsters, to immerse themselves in conflicts where mercy was weakness and conventional morality was a luxury that could not be afforded. Each campaign pushed them further from the idealistic vision of the Great Crusade, forcing them to adopt methods that were necessary for victory but corrupting to the soul. Konrad himself began to develop a philosophical framework to justify these increasingly extreme measures. He argued that human nature was fundamentally flawed, that people were naturally inclined towards selfishness and cruelty when not constrained by fear of consequences. His experiences on Nostramo and his observations of enemy behavior during the Crusade seemed to confirm this pessimistic view of humanity, leading him to conclude that terror was not merely a useful tool, but an essential component of any stable civilization. This philosophy put him at odds with several of his brother primarchs, particularly those who maintained more optimistic views of human potential. Rogal Dorn of the Imperial Fists believed that humans could be inspired to greatness through duty and honor. Robert Guilliman of the Ultramarines argued that proper education and governance could elevate human society beyond its primitive instincts. Even Leman Russ of the Space Wolves, despite his own savage methods, maintained that humans possessed an essential nobility that could be awakened through proper leadership. Konrad found these perspectives naive at best and dangerously delusional at worst. His visions continued to show him humanity's future, and in every timeline he witnessed, the species descended into corruption and civil war without the restraining influence of absolute terror. He began to see his brother Primarch's idealism as a weakness that would ultimately doom the very civilization they sought to build. These philosophical differences became increasingly apparent during joint operations where multiple legions worked together. The VIII Legion's methods often conflicted with the approaches favored by their allies, creating tension and friction that sometimes escalated into open confrontation. During the compliance of the Kratos binary, a dispute over the treatment of surrendered enemies nearly led to combat between the Night Lords and the Imperial Fists when Dawn's forces attempted to prevent what they saw as unnecessary executions. The incident was resolved through intervention by the Emperor himself, but the underlying tensions remained unaddressed. Other Primarchs began to view Konrad and his legion with suspicion, questioning whether their methods were truly necessary or simply reflections of their Primarch's disturbed psychology. This isolation only reinforced Konrad's growing conviction that he was the only one among his brothers who truly understood the nature of the galaxy they were trying to conquer. The VIII Legion's recruitment practices during this period reflected their increasing specialization in psychological warfare. While other legions sought candidates who exemplified the best of human potential, the Night Lords began actively recruiting from populations that had experienced extreme trauma. Survivors of alien raids, veterans of civil wars, individuals who had witnessed the absolute worst of human and Xenos behavior, became the preferred source of new space marines. These recruits brought valuable experience and psychological resilience to the Legion, but they also introduced elements of cynicism and moral flexibility that gradually altered the organization's culture. The idealism that had characterized the Terran-born Marines began to give way to a more pragmatic worldview that emphasized results over methods. This cultural shift was subtle at first, barely noticeable, except to those who had served with the Legion since its founding. but it would eventually transform the Night Lords into something far removed from their original purpose. The Legion's fortress monastery on Nostramo became a training ground, where new recruits learned not just the arts of war, but the psychology of terror. They studied the fears and weaknesses of different species, practiced techniques for breaking enemy morale, and learned to suppress their own empathy to better serve their function as instruments of imperial justice. The training regimen was designed to produce warriors who could inflict suffering without being corrupted by the experience, but this goal proved more elusive than anticipated. Captain Jago Sevatarian, now elevated to first captain and Konrad's primary lieutenant, became increasingly concerned about the direction the Legion was taking. He had embraced the necessity of their methods, but worried that the continuous exposure to violence and suffering was affecting even the Space Marines themselves. Veterans who had once taken pride in their role as humanity's protectors began to display signs of callousness that went beyond professional detachment. Sevatarian brought these concerns to his Primarch during one of their regular strategy sessions, hoping that Konrad's wisdom and foresight might provide solutions. Instead, he found that his genetic father had grown even more isolated and fatalistic than before. Konrad's visions of the future had become more frequent and more detailed, showing him not just the inevitability of the coming civil war, but his own role in humanity's downfall. The Night Haunter's response to his first captain's concerns was both chilling and prophetic. He explained that the Legion's transformation was not an unfortunate side effect of their missions, but a necessary adaptation to the reality of the galaxy they inhabited. The universe was a dark place, filled with enemies who understood only strength and fear, and the VIII Legion was evolving to meet that challenge. The alternative, he argued, was not moral purity, but extinction. But even as he rationalized the changes overtaking his Legion, Konrad could not escape the growing certainty that his visions of future damnation were becoming self-fulfilling prophecies. Each decision he made to embrace more extreme methods brought him closer to the monster he was destined to become, yet he felt powerless to choose a different path. The weight of prophecy had become a prison from which there seemed to be no escape. The VIII Legion's reputation continued to grow throughout the Great Crusade, but so did the whispers about their methods and their Primarch's stability. Other Imperial commanders began to request their services less frequently, preferring to handle difficult situations with conventional forces rather than invoke the Night Lord's particular brand of justice. This isolation only reinforced the Legion's sense that they were misunderstood and unappreciated, setting the stage for the resentments that would eventually drive them into open rebellion. The transformation of the VIII Legion from righteous instruments of imperial justice into something far darker began not with a single dramatic moment, but through countless small compromises that accumulated over decades like poison in a wound. The first signs were subtle, noticed only by the most perceptive observers who had known the Legion during its earliest days. Veterans who had once shown restraint in victory began to linger over their enemies' deaths. Marines who had previously taken no pleasure in their grim duties started to display an enthusiasm that bordered on the disturbing. On Nostramo itself, the absence of its Primarch and the cream of its population had created a vacuum that the planet's old evils were eager to fill. The criminal organizations that Konrad Curze had so thoroughly dismantled began to reconstitute themselves in new forms, learning from their predecessors' mistakes and adapting to the changed environment. They understood now that direct confrontation with authority was futile, so they embraced subtlety and corruption as their primary weapons. The noble houses that had survived the Night Haunters' purges discovered that their reduced numbers actually made them more powerful rather than less so. With fewer competitors for influence and resources, the remaining families found it easier to establish monopolies over various sectors of Nostramo's economy. They learned to present facades of legitimacy and civic responsibility while conducting their true business through intermediaries and shell organizations that provided multiple layers of protection against investigation. More insidiously, these renewed criminal enterprises began to infiltrate the very institutions that Konrad had established to maintain order. The planetary guard units that enforced his laws were gradually populated by individuals who owed their real loyalty to crime bosses rather than to imperial authority. The administrative bureaucracy that managed Nostramo's affairs became riddled with corruption as officials discovered that cooperation with the underworld was far more profitable than honest service. The recruitment centers that supplied new candidates for the VIII Legion became particular targets for criminal influence. Gang leaders understood that having allies among the Space Marines would provide protection and advancement opportunities that no amount of money could purchase through conventional means. They began systematically placing their most promising young criminals in positions where they would be selected for Legion service, essentially infiltrating the Night Lords with agents of the very corruption Konrad had sought to eliminate. These corrupted recruits brought with them not just personal loyalties to criminal organizations, but an entire worldview that celebrated violence for its own sake rather than as a necessary tool of justice. They had grown up viewing cruelty as entertainment and suffering as commodity, perspectives that were fundamentally incompatible with the Legion's original mission, but which became increasingly normalized as their numbers grew within the ranks. Captain Shang of the 4th Company was among the first Legion officers to recognize the scope of this infiltration, but his attempts to address the problem were met with resistance from unexpected quarters. Many of his brother officers had formed personal relationships with the newer recruits and refused to believe that their comrades could be anything other than loyal Space Marines. Others argued that the recruits' criminal backgrounds actually made them more effective warriors, better suited to the moral ambiguities of the campaigns they were assigned to fight. Shang's investigations revealed that the corruption went beyond simple criminal influence. The noble houses had established a sophisticated intelligence network that monitored the VIII Legion activities and provided early warning of any operations that might threaten their interests. They had even managed to place agents within the Legion's support staff, individuals who could influence supply deliveries, communication systems, and other critical infrastructure. But perhaps most disturbing was Shang's discovery that some Legion officers were not merely unaware of this corruption, but actively participating in it. They had formed partnerships with Nostramo criminal organizations, using their positions to facilitate smuggling operations, slave trading, and other illegal activities. These Space Marines justified their actions as necessary intelligence gathering or as ways of maintaining connections to their homeworld's population, but the reality was far more sinister. The psychological impact on the broader Legion was profound and lasting. Marines who had once viewed their homeworld with pride and affection began to see it as a source of shame and contamination. The knowledge that their own recruiting base had been compromised called into question everything they thought they understood about their identity and purpose. If Nostramo could not be trusted to provide worthy candidates for the Legion, then what did that say about the Marines who had already been recruited from that world? Konrad Curze's reaction to these revelations was characteristically extreme and self-destructive. Rather than attempting to reform the corrupted systems or implement new safeguards against future infiltration, he became convinced that the rot was too deep to be excised through conventional means. His visions had shown him glimpses of this corruption, but experiencing it in reality triggered a psychological crisis that would have lasting consequences for both him and his legion. The Night Haunter began to view the corruption of Nostramo not as a failure of his methods, but as confirmation of his pessimistic beliefs about human nature. He had brought perfect order to his homeworld through terror, but the moment his direct supervision was removed, the population had reverted to its criminal instincts. This seemed to prove that fear was indeed the only reliable motivator for human behavior, that mercy and trust were luxuries that led inevitably to betrayal and decay. More troubling still, Konrad began to suspect that the corruption had spread beyond Nostramo to infect the Legion itself. His paranoia, always a significant factor in his personality, intensified to the point where he began to question the loyalty of even his most trusted officers. He implemented increasingly draconian internal security measures, subjecting his own Marines to surveillance and interrogation that would have been considered excessive even by the standards of other legions. His suspicions were not entirely unfounded. Several veteran sergeants had indeed formed secret alliances with criminal organizations on worlds the Legion had conquered, using their positions to establish smuggling networks and protection rackets. Other Marines had begun to take personal trophies from their victims, not as military honors but as macabre souvenirs of their capacity for cruelty. The line between necessary ruthlessness and sadistic enjoyment was becoming increasingly blurred. The VIII Legion's combat performance began to suffer as internal tensions and mistrust undermined unit cohesion. Marines, who had once fought with perfect coordination, now watched each other for signs of treachery or excessive brutality. Officers spent more time investigating their subordinates than planning military operations. The psychological warfare techniques that had made the Legion so effective against external enemies were turning inward, creating an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that poisoned every aspect of their culture. First Captain Jago Sevatarian found himself caught between competing loyalties as the situation deteriorated. His dedication to Konrad Curze was absolute, but he could see that his Primarch's increasing paranoia and fatalism were destroying the very Legion they both sought to preserve. Sevatarian's attempts to maintain discipline and morale were undermined by Konrad's erratic behavior and his tendency to see conspiracy and corruption in every shadow. The breaking point came during the Kratos compliance, when Konrad publicly executed 3 of his own captains on charges of corruption and betrayal. The evidence against them was circumstantial at best, based more on the Night Haunter's visions of potential futures than on any concrete proof of wrongdoing. The executions were carried out with the same methodical brutality that the Legion employed against its enemies, sending a clear message that no one was beyond suspicion. The psychological impact on the surviving officers was devastating. If even captains with decades of loyal service could be executed on the basis of prophetic visions, then no one in the Legion was truly safe. This realization created a culture of fear that extended far beyond healthy respect for authority, becoming a paralyzing terror that prevented honest communication and mutual trust. The corrupted recruits from Nostramo observed these developments with satisfaction, recognizing them as opportunities to advance their own positions within the Legion hierarchy. They understood instinctively how to navigate the poisonous atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia, having grown up in similar conditions on their homeworld. While honest Marines struggled with the moral complexities of their situation, the criminals thrived in an environment that rewarded cunning and ruthlessness above traditional military virtues. Konrad himself seemed increasingly disconnected from the day-to-day operations of his legion, spending long periods in meditation that bordered on catatonia as his visions of the future became more frequent and more detailed. He began to speak of destiny and inevitability with a fervor that concerned even his most loyal followers. The Night Haunter, who had once fought against fate, now seemed to embrace it, accepting his role as an agent of darkness rather than continuing to struggle against his prophetic destiny. The changes in the Legion's culture became apparent to outside observers during joint operations with other Imperial forces. The VIII Legion's methods, always extreme by conventional standards, now displayed an element of casual cruelty that went beyond tactical necessity. Their treatment of prisoners became increasingly harsh. Their interaction with civilian populations grew more threatening, and their cooperation with Allied forces deteriorated as they became convinced that everyone around them was either corrupt or naive. Other Primarchs began to express concerns about their brother's condition and the state of his legion. Rogal Dorn, always direct in his communications, confronted Konrad about reports of excessive brutality and declining discipline within the VIII Legion. The conversation quickly escalated into a heated argument about the nature of justice and the necessity of fear as a tool of governance, revealing philosophical differences that had been growing for decades. Vulcan of the Salamanders attempted a gentler approach, trying to reach out to Konrad as a concerned brother rather than a critic of his methods. But the Night Haunter's response was paranoid and defensive, interpreting even friendly concern as evidence of conspiracy and betrayal. He began to withdraw from the Brotherhood of Primarchs, isolating himself and his legion from potential allies who might have been able to help address the growing problems within the VIII Legion. The corruption that had begun on Nostramo was now spreading throughout the Legion like a cancer, transforming noble warriors into something darker and more sinister. The Night Lords were beginning to live up to their name in ways that even Konrad had not anticipated, becoming lords of the literal night that was descending upon their souls. The stage was set for even greater disasters that would ultimately consume not just the VIII Legion, but threaten the very foundations of the Imperium itself. The transformation of Konrad Curze from the Emperor's loyal son into something far more dangerous reached its critical phase during the events that would later be known as the Sherot Incident. What began as a routine compliance action against a world that had refused to accept Imperial rule became a watershed moment that revealed the true extent of the Night Haunter's psychological deterioration and the corruption that had infected his entire legion. The world of Sherot was inhabited by a human population that had developed a sophisticated but insular civilization during the Age of Strife. They possessed advanced technology and a stable government, but they also practiced cultural traditions that included ritualistic scarification and ancestor worship that Imperial authorities deemed incompatible with the imperial truth. Their initial refusal to abandon these practices and accept full integration into the Imperium was seen as minor rebellion that could be resolved through negotiation or limited military action. The compliance fleet sent to Kera included not only elements of the VIII Legion, but also representatives from the Imperial Army and the nascent administratum, who were tasked with establishing imperial governance once military resistance had been overcome. These officials expected a relatively straightforward operation that would conclude with the planet's peaceful integration into the growing Imperium, following patterns that had been established on thousands of similar worlds. Konrad Curze's approach to the Sherrod situation revealed how far his thinking had diverged from standard imperial doctrine. Rather than beginning with diplomatic overtures or limited military demonstrations, he immediately implemented a campaign of terror designed to break the population's will to resist before formal hostilities even began. The VIII Legion began by infiltrating the planet's major cities and conducting targeted assassinations of political and religious leaders, leaving their mutilated corpses in public spaces as warnings. But these were not the surgical strikes that had characterized the Legion's earlier operations. The killings were unnecessarily brutal and theatrical, designed more to traumatize witnesses than to achieve specific military objectives. The Night Lords began to take visible pleasure in their work, lingering over their victims' deaths and creating elaborate displays of violence that served no tactical purpose beyond the satisfaction of inflicting suffering. The Sherrod population's response to this campaign was not the immediate surrender that Konrad had anticipated. Instead, they rallied around their surviving leaders and began organizing a resistance movement that combined conventional military tactics with guerrilla warfare techniques. Their cultural traditions of ritual scarification had prepared them psychologically for physical pain, making them more resilient to terror tactics than the VIII Legion had expected. This unexpected resistance triggered something dark and primal in Konrad's psyche. His visions had shown him that Sherrod would fall within days of his arrival, but the reality of prolonged resistance seemed to call into question his prophetic abilities and his understanding of human psychology. Rather than adapting his strategy to account for local conditions, he doubled down on terror tactics, escalating the brutality of his methods in an attempt to force reality to conform to his visions. The VIII Legion's subsequent actions on Sherrod crossed lines that even other Space Marine legions found disturbing. They began systematically targeting civilian populations, not as collateral damage in military operations, but as deliberate terror weapons designed to break their enemies' morale. Entire city blocks were depopulated through mass executions, their inhabitants flayed alive, and their bodies arranged in grotesque monuments to the Night Lord's power. Imperial Army commanders who witnessed these atrocities attempted to intervene, arguing that such methods were counterproductive and violated the basic principles of the Great Crusade. Their protests were met with threats and intimidation from the VIII Legion officers, who made it clear that interference with their operations would be considered treasonous. Several Imperial Army officers who persisted in their objections were found dead under mysterious circumstances, their deaths clearly intended as warnings to others. The situation deteriorated further when news of the Sherrod campaign reached other Imperial forces operating in nearby systems. Reports of the VIII Legion's methods spread through the military hierarchy, creating a growing sense of unease about Konrad Curze's fitness for command and the reliability of his legion. Other Primarchs began to receive fragmentary accounts of atrocities that seemed to go far beyond the necessary brutalities of warfare. Rogel Dorn of the Imperial Fists was the first to confront Konrad directly about these reports. Their meeting, which took place aboard Dorn's flagship, while both Primarchs were traveling to the Ulana system for the great triumph celebrating the defeat of the Orc overlord Uruk, quickly escalated from professional discussion to heated argument. Dorn's straightforward manner and uncompromising sense of duty clashed violently with Konrad's increasingly paranoid worldview and his conviction that extreme methods were not only justified, but necessary. The argument reached its climax when Dorn accused Konrad of betraying the ideals of the Great Crusade and dishonoring their father's vision for humanity's future. In response, Konrad experienced one of his prophetic visions with unprecedented clarity and intensity, seeing not just Dorn's words, but the future consequences of this confrontation echoing through the decades to come. The vision showed him the Horus heresy in vivid detail, revealing that his brother Rogel would one day stand as one of the Emperor's most loyal defenders, while Konrad himself would be counted among the traitors. The psychological impact of this vision was catastrophic for Konrad's already fragile mental state. The certainty of his own future betrayal, combined with the immediate stress of Dorn's accusations, triggered a violent episode that would become legendary among the Space Marine legions. Without warning or apparent provocation, the Night Haunter launched himself at Dorn with savage fury, his claws extended and his face twisted into a mask of primal rage. The battle between the two Primarchs was brief but devastating. Dorn's defensive skills and disciplined fighting style were well suited to containing Konrad's frenzied assault, but the Night Haunter's speed and ferocity made him a dangerous opponent even for a warrior of Dorn's caliber. The fight ended only when other Primarchs intervened, physically separating the combatants and preventing what could have been a fatal confrontation. The aftermath of this incident sent shockwaves throughout the Great Crusade's command structure. The idea that one Primarch would attack another without provocation was almost unthinkable, calling into question fundamental assumptions about the stability and reliability of the Emperor's gene-forged sons. Emergency councils were convened, communications were sent to Terra, and contingency plans were developed to address the possibility that other Primarchs might be similarly unstable. Konrad's response to these developments revealed the extent of his psychological deterioration. Rather than expressing remorse or attempting to explain his actions, he began to speak openly about the visions that had guided his attack on Dorn. He described in disturbing detail the future civil war that would tear the Imperium apart, identifying specific individuals who would betray their oaths and specific events that would lead to catastrophe. These prophecies were initially dismissed as the ravings of a disturbed mind, but their specificity and internal consistency began to worry those who heard them. Some of the events Konrad described seemed not just possible but likely given current political tensions within the imperial hierarchy. His predictions about individual behavior patterns proved unnervingly accurate when tested against subsequent observations of the people he had identified as future traitors. The Emperor himself was forced to intervene, summoning Konrad to Terra for evaluation and possible treatment. The meeting between father and son took place in the deepest levels of the Imperial Palace, away from any witnesses who might later spread accounts of what was discussed. The details of their conversation remained secret, but its consequences became apparent immediately afterward when Konrad was placed under house arrest pending further investigation of his mental condition. The imprisonment of a Primarch was unprecedented in the history of the Great Crusade and created a crisis of confidence that rippled throughout the Imperial military hierarchy. If one of the Emperor's gene-forged sons could prove unstable and dangerous, what did that say about the others? How could ordinary humans trust beings with such vast power if that power could be turned against the very people they were sworn to protect? Konrad's captivity lasted only a few weeks before he escaped through methods that demonstrated capabilities far beyond what his guards had anticipated. Security footage showed him moving through the Imperial Palace's most secure areas with ease, avoiding detection systems that should have been impossible to circumvent and overcoming barriers that had been designed to contain even superhuman beings. His escape route took him through sections of the palace that few living beings had ever seen, suggesting an intimate knowledge of the structure that he should not have possessed. The Night Haunter's return to his legion was marked by changes in both his behavior and his appearance that disturbed even his most loyal followers. He seemed more gaunt and pale than before, his eyes burning with an intensity that was uncomfortable to meet directly. His movements had taken on a predatory quality that made even Space Marines instinctively wary of approaching too closely. Most disturbing of all, he began to speak casually about future events as though they were historical facts, displaying a certainty about coming disasters that bordered on eagerness. The VIII Legion's reception of their returned Primarch revealed how completely they had been transformed by the corruption that had been growing within their ranks. Rather than expressing concern about his imprisonment or relief at his return, many of the Marines seemed energized by evidence of his defiance against Imperial authority. The criminal elements that had infiltrated the Legion saw his escape and rebellion as validation of their own rejection of conventional morality and law. Under Konrad's renewed leadership, the VIII Legion began to operate with increasing independence from Imperial command structures. They accepted assignments that aligned with their Primarch's vision of necessary warfare, while ignoring or actively undermining operations that they considered pointless or counterproductive. This selective obedience created friction with other Imperial forces and raised questions about their ultimate loyalty to the Emperor and the Great Crusade. The stage was now set for even greater disasters that would ultimately consume not just the Night Lords, but threaten the foundations of human civilization itself. The corruption that had begun as small compromises and moral flexibility had metastasized into something that threatened to destroy everything the Great Crusade had sought to achieve. The rising threat was no longer external enemies or Xenos civilizations, but the darkness that had taken root in the hearts of humanity's own defenders. The period following Konrad Curze's escape from Imperial custody marked the beginning of what would later be recognized as the VIII Legion's final transformation from Imperial weapon into something altogether more sinister. The Night Haunter's newfound certainty about the coming civil war had liberated him from any remaining constraints of Imperial doctrine or moral consideration. If betrayal and bloodshed were inevitable, he reasoned, then preparing for that reality took precedence over maintaining the illusion of loyalty to a doomed cause. The changes in the VIII Legion's operational methods during this period were both subtle and profound, representing not merely an escalation of existing practices, but a fundamental reimagining of their purpose and identity. Where once they had employed terror as a tool to achieve military objectives, they now began to embrace terror as an end unto itself, developing increasingly sophisticated techniques for inflicting psychological trauma that served no strategic purpose beyond the satisfaction of causing suffering. The Legion's first major innovation was the systematic development of what they termed prophetic warfare, a doctrine based on Konrad's visions of future events. Rather than responding to enemy actions as they occurred, the VIII Legion began pre-positioning forces and preparing countermeasures for battles that had not yet begun. This approach proved devastatingly effective against conventional opponents who found themselves fighting an enemy that seemed to anticipate their every move. But the true horror of prophetic warfare lay not in its tactical applications, but in its psychological implications. The Night Lords began targeting not just enemy combatants, but specific individuals whose future actions would prove problematic for their operations. Children who would grow up to become resistance leaders were eliminated in their cribs. Scientists whose research might lead to defensive innovations were assassinated before their work could begin. Entire bloodlines were exterminated to prevent the birth of individuals who might someday oppose them. These preemptive strikes created a reign of terror that extended far beyond conventional warfare, turning every Imperial world into a hunting ground where anyone might be marked for death, based on crimes they had not yet committed. The psychological impact on civilian populations was profound and lasting, creating a climate of paranoia and despair that made resistance seem not just futile, but actively dangerous to contemplate. The VIII Legion's recruitment practices during this period abandoned any pretense of selecting candidates based on traditional Space Marine virtues. Instead, they began actively seeking out individuals who displayed specific psychological traits that would make them effective agents of terror. Psychopaths, sadists, and others who derived pleasure from causing pain were identified and elevated within the Legion's hierarchy, their natural inclinations refined and weaponized through Space Marine enhancement procedures. This selective recruitment created a feedback loop that accelerated the Legion's corruption, as each new generation of Marines was more twisted and brutal than the last. Veterans who retained some connection to the VIII Legion's original purpose found themselves increasingly isolated and marginalized, their voices drowned out by younger Marines who had never known anything but violence and cruelty as expressions of Imperial will. The Legion's fortress monastery on Nostramo was transformed during this period into something that resembled a temple to human suffering more than a military installation. The training facilities were redesigned to incorporate torture chambers where recruits learned to inflict pain with scientific precision. Libraries were established to catalog different species' fear responses and psychological vulnerabilities. Laboratories were constructed where captured enemies could be subjected to experimental procedures designed to test the limits of consciousness and sanity. Captain Jago Sevatarian, despite his unwavering loyalty to Konrad Curze, found himself deeply disturbed by these developments. The first captain had embraced the necessity of harsh methods in service of Imperial goals, but the Legion's current trajectory seemed to have abandoned those goals entirely in favor of pursuing cruelty for its own sake. His attempts to discuss these concerns with his Primarch were met with responses that revealed how completely Konrad's worldview had been altered by his visions of the future. The Night Haunter no longer spoke of serving the Emperor or protecting humanity from external threats. Instead, he described his Legion's mission in terms of preparing humanity for the darkness that was coming, conditioning the species to survive in a universe where mercy was weakness and compassion was fatal naivety. The Great Crusade had been an attempt to create a civilization based on hope and cooperation, but Konrad's visions showed him that such idealism would ultimately lead to catastrophic failure. The Eighth Legion's new approach to warfare was demonstrated with devastating effectiveness during the Krath campaign, where they were tasked with bringing a cluster of rebellious worlds back into Imperial compliance. Rather than conducting traditional military operations, the Night Lords implemented what they called Cascade Terror, a strategy designed to make each world's submission trigger psychological breakdown on neighboring systems. The campaign began on Krath Prime, where the Eighth Legion employed their enhanced interrogation techniques to extract detailed information about the rebel leadership's personal fears and psychological vulnerabilities. This intelligence was then used to craft terror campaigns tailored to each individual target, breaking their will to resist through methods that attacked their minds rather than their bodies. But the true innovation lay in how the Night Lords used their victories on Krath Prime to terrorize the remaining rebel worlds. Detailed recordings of the interrogation sessions were broadcast throughout the system, allowing populations on other worlds to witness exactly what fate awaited them if they continued their resistance. The recordings were edited and enhanced to maximize their psychological impact, using sophisticated understanding of human psychology to create propaganda that was literally too terrifying for most people to watch. The results exceeded even Konrad's expectations. 3 of the remaining rebel worlds surrendered immediately upon receiving the broadcasts, their governments collapsing as populations demanded capitulation rather than risk experiencing similar treatment. The remaining worlds attempted to continue their resistance, but their military forces were crippled by desertion and psychological breakdown, as soldiers refused to fight an enemy capable of such systematic cruelty. The Krath campaign established the template that would guide VIII Legion operations for the remainder of their service to the Imperium. They became specialists, not in conquest, but in the complete psychological destruction of their enemy's will to resist. Their methods proved so effective that other Imperial commanders began requesting their services specifically for situations where traditional military approaches had failed to produce results. Yet this success came at a cost that would not become fully apparent until much later. The Eighth Legion's embrace of systematic cruelty had begun to attract attention from forces that existed beyond the material universe. The Chaos Gods, always eager to corrupt humanity's defenders, found in the Night Lords a legion that was already walking the path toward damnation. Subtle influences began to seep into their ranks, encouraging their worst impulses and rewarding their most depraved innovations. The first signs of supernatural corruption appeared during the Grail World campaign, where several Eighth Legion Marines reported experiencing visions that were distinct from their Primarch's prophetic abilities. These visions promised power and knowledge in exchange for embracing darker methods of warfare, whispering suggestions that pushed the Legion toward even greater extremes of violence and sadism. Konrad himself seemed immune to these supernatural influences, protected perhaps by the clarity of his own visions or by some aspect of his genetic engineering that the chaos gods could not penetrate. But he was either unaware of or indifferent to the corruption spreading through his legion, focused entirely on preparing for the civil war that he knew was coming. The Night Haunter's increasing detachment from day-to-day operations created opportunities for other influences to shape the Legion's development. Senior officers who had embraced the new doctrine of systematic terror began implementing their own innovations, competing with each other to develop increasingly sophisticated methods of psychological warfare. This internal competition created an environment where restraint was seen as weakness and excessive cruelty was rewarded with promotion and recognition. The transformation was perhaps most visible in the Legion's treatment of prisoners and civilians, where once they had killed quickly and efficiently to serve specific tactical purposes, they now prolonged their victims' suffering to study the effects of different torture techniques. Elaborate execution methods were developed not for their military effectiveness, but for their ability to terrorize witnesses and create lasting psychological trauma in survivor populations. These innovations were documented and codified in training manuals that were distributed throughout the Legion, ensuring that new recruits would learn these techniques as standard doctrine rather than aberrant behavior. The VIII Legion was systematically institutionalizing methods that would have been considered war crimes by the standards of more civilized societies, transforming their entire culture around the celebration of human suffering. The point of no return was reached during the compliance of Olympia, where the VIII Legion was deployed alongside the Iron Warriors to suppress a rebellion that had erupted on Perturbo's adoptive homeworld. The campaign provided an opportunity for the two legions to compare methods and learn from each other's approaches to warfare, but the collaboration revealed just how far the Night Lords had diverged from standard Imperial doctrine. Where the Iron Warriors approached the rebellion as a military problem, requiring systematic siege warfare and overwhelming firepower, the VIII Legion treated it as an opportunity to field test their newest terror techniques. They began by infiltrating Olympian cities to conduct targeted assassinations designed not to eliminate military leaders, but to create maximum psychological impact on the civilian population. The methods they employed were so extreme that even the Iron Warriors, known for their ruthless efficiency, expressed discomfort with their allies' approach. The breaking point came when VIII Legion forces began conducting what they termed educational executions in Olympian town squares, torturing captured rebels to death in public displays designed to demonstrate the consequences of resistance. These spectacles were choreographed with theatrical precision, using techniques derived from their studies of human psychology to maximize the trauma inflicted on witnesses. Perturbo himself was forced to intervene when reports of these atrocities reached his command staff, but his attempts to moderate the Night Lords' methods were met with defiance and barely concealed contempt. The VIII Legion officers made it clear that they viewed the Iron Warriors' concerns as evidence of weakness and moral confusion, arguing that their methods were more effective at achieving compliance than conventional military force. This confrontation marked the final severing of the Night Lords' connection to Imperial ideals and values. They had become something new and terrible, a force that served the Emperor in name only while pursuing goals that were fundamentally opposed to everything the Great Crusade claimed to represent. The stage was set for their inevitable alliance with forces that would give them the freedom to pursue their darkest impulses without the constraints of imperial oversight. When the first whispers of rebellion began to circulate through the War Master's inner circle, Konrad Curze received them not as shocking news, but as confirmation of visions that had tormented him for decades. The Night Haunter had witnessed Horus's corruption in prophetic dreams long before the first seeds of heresy were planted on Davin, had seen the civil war that would tear the Imperium apart before the conspirators themselves understood the scope of their ambitions. For him, the Horus heresy was not a choice, but an inevitability that he had been preparing for since the day he first glimpsed the darkness waiting in humanity's future. The approach made to him by Horus's agents came during the VIII Legion's operations in the Eastern Fringe, where they had been conducting what Imperial records euphemistically described as compliance actions against worlds that had dared to question the increasingly harsh methods of the Great Crusade. In reality, these operations had become testing grounds for the Night Lords' most extreme innovations in psychological warfare. Laboratories where they could refine their techniques without interference from more squeamish Imperial commanders. The initial contact was made through Captain Iago Cull of the VIII Legion, a word-bearer who had been carefully selected for his ability to speak the language of fatalism and inevitability that had become Konrad's primary mode of discourse. Cull approached the Night Haunter not with promises of glory or power, but with philosophical arguments about the nature of truth and the necessity of embracing, rather than fighting, against the fundamental darkness that existed at the heart of human civilization. Konrad's response to these overtures revealed how completely his worldview had been shaped by his prophetic visions. He expressed no surprise at Horus's rebellion, no shock at the revelation that half the Primarchs would turn against their father. Instead, he spoke of relief at finally being able to abandon the pretense of loyalty to ideals he had long since recognized as naive and doomed. The Great Crusade's vision of human enlightenment had always been a lie, he argued, a beautiful fantasy that could not survive contact with the universe's true nature. The Night Haunter's decision to join the rebellion was not driven by ambition or corruption in the traditional sense, but by a fatalistic acceptance that this was the role he had been created to play. His visions had shown him that he would be counted among the traitors, that his legion would become one of the most feared forces opposing the Emperor, that their methods would make even their fellow rebels uncomfortable with their alliance. Since these outcomes were inevitable, he reasoned, the only logical course was to embrace them fully and use them to serve some greater purpose. But Konrad's conception of that greater purpose was radically different from the goals that motivated other traitor Primarchs. Where Magnus sought knowledge and vindication, where Angron pursued vengeance and freedom from imperial constraints, the Night Haunter saw the coming civil war as an opportunity to teach humanity the fundamental lesson about its own nature. The species needed to understand that civilization was a thin veneer covering an abyss of cruelty and selfishness, that peace and cooperation were temporary aberrations that would always give way to violence and exploitation. The VIII Legion's transition from Imperial loyalists to open rebels was remarkably smooth, requiring none of the ideological restructuring or psychological reconditioning that other legions underwent during their turn to chaos. The Night Lords had already abandoned most of their Imperial conditioning during their descent into systematic terrorism, and their current methods were so extreme that formal rebellion simply removed unwanted constraints rather than requiring fundamental changes in behavior or doctrine. The Legion's first major operation, as declared traitors, was the systematic elimination of Imperial loyalists within their own ranks, a purge that Konrad had been planning since his escape from Terror. The Night Haunter possessed detailed intelligence about every member of his legion, knowledge gained through years of surveillance and prophetic visions that revealed each Marine's ultimate loyalty. Those who would have remained faithful to the Emperor were identified and eliminated before they could pose a threat to the Legion's unity. This internal purge was conducted with the same methodical precision that characterized all 8 Legion operations, but with an added element of personal betrayal that made it particularly devastating for those who survived. Marines who had served together for decades were forced to watch their battle brothers tortured to death on charges of insufficient commitment to their Primarch's vision. The psychological impact was deliberately calculated to ensure that no one questioned their new allegiance or harbored secret doubts about their chosen path. The elimination of the loyalist elements within the 8th Legion had an unexpected consequence that Konrad had not anticipated in his visions. With the moderating influence of the more traditional Marines removed, the criminal and psychopathic elements that had infiltrated the Legion's ranks were free to assert their influence more openly. The Night Lords began to develop an internal culture that celebrated cruelty and suffering as virtues in themselves, rather than as necessary tools for achieving military objectives. This cultural transformation was accelerated by the Legion's first joint operations with other traitor forces, where they encountered word-bearers who had been touched by demonic influence, and Emperor's children who had begun their descent into the pursuit of sensation and excess. These interactions exposed the 8th Legion to concepts and practices that pushed their already extreme methods into territories that bordered on the supernatural. The Night Lords' participation in the Dropsite massacre on Istvan Viv demonstrated both their effectiveness as traitors and the extent to which they had been transformed by their rebellion. They were among the forces that turned on the Loyalist legions during what should have been a coordinated assault against Horus's stronghold, contributing to one of the most devastating betrayals in Imperial history. But their methods during the massacre revealed that they were no longer simply soldiers following orders, but something far more sinister. Where other traitor legions focused on eliminating their enemies as efficiently as possible, the 8th Legion prolonged the slaughter to maximize the psychological trauma inflicted on both their victims and any potential witnesses. They took particular pleasure in hunting down wounded loyalists who had survived the initial betrayal, subjecting them to elaborate torture sessions that served no strategic purpose beyond the satisfaction of causing suffering. The massacre also marked the beginning of the Night Lords' systematic collection of what they termed educational materials, recordings and artifacts that documented their enemies' final moments in excruciating detail. These materials would later be used in terror campaigns against loyalist worlds, proof that even the Emperor's most elite warriors could be broken and humiliated when confronted with sufficient application of fear and pain. Konrad's behavior during and after the Dropsite massacre revealed the full extent of his psychological transformation. The Primarch, who had once fought to protect the innocent, now took personal satisfaction in the slaughter of his former brothers, seeing their deaths not as tragedies, but as necessary lessons about the futility of resisting fate. His visions had shown him this outcome, and its realization seemed to validate his belief that acceptance of darkness was preferable to futile struggle against inevitable doom. The Eight Legions' post-Istvan operations established them as one of the most feared forces in the growing civil war, but their reputation was built on methods that disturbed even their fellow traitors. While other rebel legions fought to achieve specific strategic objectives, the Night Lords seemed to conduct warfare primarily for the opportunity to inflict terror and suffering on their enemies. Their campaigns became elaborate exercises in psychological torture that happened to involve military objectives as secondary considerations. The Legion's approach to siege warfare during this period exemplified their transformation from soldiers into agents of pure malevolence. Rather than attempting to breach enemy fortifications through conventional assault or siege engines, they would establish complete blockades around their targets and then systematically destroy the defenders' will to resist through carefully orchestrated campaigns of terror. Supply convoys would be ambushed not just to deny resources to the enemy, but to provide fresh victims for public torture sessions within sight of the besieged fortifications. These torture sessions were broadcast directly into the enemy positions using captured communication equipment, forcing defenders to witness the fate that awaited them if they continued their resistance. The Night Lords had learned to use their enemies' own moral convictions against them, exploiting their attachment to fellow soldiers and innocent civilians to create psychological pressure that was more effective than any siege engine. The breaking point for many Imperial defenders came not from physical hardship or military defeat, but from the realization that surrender would not end their suffering, but simply change its nature. The Night Lords had abandoned any pretense of accepting honorable capitulation, instead treating surrendering enemies as raw materials for their increasingly elaborate experiments in inflicting psychological and physical trauma. But perhaps most disturbing was the way the Eighth Legion began to document and study their own transformation, treating their descent into monstrosity as a subject worthy of scientific investigation. They established archives to catalog different techniques for breaking human will, conducted experiments to determine the most effective methods for inducing specific types of fear, and developed theoretical frameworks for understanding terror as both weapon and art form. This systematic approach to cruelty represented something unprecedented in the galaxy's long history of warfare. The Night Lords were not simply brutal soldiers or even sadistic killers, but scholars of suffering who brought intellectual rigor to the study of human misery. They had transformed themselves into something that transcended traditional categories of evil, becoming a force that existed specifically to explore and exploit the darkest possibilities of sentient experience. The Great Betrayal had given them the freedom to pursue these investigations without constraint or oversight, but it had also set them on a path that would ultimately isolate them from even their fellow traitors. The Night Lords were becoming something that existed beyond conventional alliance or loyalty, a force that served chaos not through corruption or ambition, but through the simple pursuit of their own twisted version of truth about the universe's fundamental nature. The Thrammer's Crusade represented the Night Lords' finest hour as a unified military force, and simultaneously marked the beginning of their dissolution into the fractured warbands that would define their existence for the next 10 millennia. The campaign pitted the VIII Legion against the Dark Angels and their Primarch Lionel Johnson in a conflict that would span multiple star systems and demonstrate both the tactical brilliance and the fundamental instability that had come to characterize Konrad Curze's approach to warfare. The Threema sector had been selected by Horus as a crucial battleground in his strategy, to prevent loyalist reinforcements from reaching Terra during the final stages of his rebellion. The region's strategic importance lay not in its industrial capacity or population centers, but in its position along the primary warp routes that connected the galaxy's outer regions to the Sol system. Control of Threema would allow the traitors to intercept and destroy loyal Space Marine legions attempting to return to defend their emperor. Konrad Curze's assignment to this theater of operations was both a recognition of his tactical capabilities and an attempt by the War Master to isolate the increasingly unpredictable Night Haunter from the main thrust of the rebellion. Horus had grown uncomfortable with the VIII Legion's methods and their Primarch's disturbing tendency to pursue personal vendettas rather than strategic objectives. The Threema's crusade offered an opportunity to channel Konrad's destructive impulses in a direction that would serve the rebellion's goals while keeping him away from more sensitive operations. The early phases of the campaign showcased the Night Lords at their most effective, employing the sophisticated terror tactics they had developed during their descent into systematic brutality. Rather than engaging the Dark Angels in conventional fleet actions or planetary assaults, the VIII Legion implemented what they termed cascade warfare, a strategy designed to collapse entire subsectors through targeted psychological pressure applied at critical points in the enemy's command structure. The campaign began with the systematic elimination of Imperial Navy command personnel throughout the Threema sector, not through direct military action, but through infiltration and assassination missions that demonstrated the Night Lord's ability to strike anywhere at any time. Fleet admirals were found dead in their sealed quarters, with messages carved into their flesh warning of the consequences of continued resistance. Staff officers disappeared during routine operations, their bodies later discovered in public spaces, arranged in grotesque displays that served as warnings to their colleagues. But the true genius of the Night Lords' approach lay in their manipulation of intelligence networks and communication systems throughout the sector. They had learned to use the Imperial military's own information infrastructure against it, feeding false reports and manipulated data that created an atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust among loyalist commanders. Fleet captains began to suspect their subordinates of treachery. Garrison commanders questioned the loyalty of their troops, and coordination between different Imperial forces broke down as each unit became convinced that their allies had been compromised. Lionel Johnson's arrival in the Threema sector with a substantial Dark Angels fleet should have provided the leadership and coordination necessary to counter the Night Lords' unconventional tactics. The Lion was widely regarded as one of the most capable military minds among the Primarchs, with a strategic acumen that had proven effective against a wide range of enemies during the Great Crusade. His reputation for ruthless efficiency and absolute loyalty to the Emperor made him an ideal choice to face Konrad Curze's rebellion. The initial confrontation between the two Primarchs took place not on a battlefield, but in the sphere of psychological warfare, where Konrad had developed his greatest expertise. Rather than seeking direct engagement with the Dark Angels fleet, the Night Haunter began a campaign specifically designed to exploit what he perceived as fundamental weaknesses in his brother's character and command philosophy. Konrad's visions had revealed to him intimate details about Lion L. Johnson's psychology, including his deep-seated fears about betrayal and his paranoid suspicions about the loyalty of his own subordinates. The Night Haunter began feeding carefully crafted intelligence to the Dark Angels that seemed to confirm the Lion's worst suspicions about internal treachery within his legion. False evidence was planted, suggesting that certain Dark Angels commanders had been in communication with traitor forces, while other information implied that Luther and the fallen angels on Caliban were planning their own rebellion against their Primarch. These psychological attacks proved devastatingly effective against a commander who was already prone to suspicion and isolation. Lionel Johnson began implementing increasingly draconian security measures within his own forces, conducting internal investigations and purges that served the Night Lords' purposes far more effectively than any direct military assault could have achieved. The Dark Angels' combat effectiveness was degraded not by enemy action but by their own Primarch's growing paranoia and mistrust. The campaign's most significant engagement occurred in the Perdita system, where a substantial portion of both legions' fleets converged in what should have been a decisive. Instead, the confrontation became a masterpiece of misdirection and psychological manipulation that demonstrated both Konrad's tactical brilliance and his increasing detachment from conventional military objectives. Rather than seeking to destroy the Dark Angels' fleet, the Night Lords implemented a complex strategy designed to capture key personnel for use in their terror campaigns. Boarding actions were conducted not to seize enemy vessels, but to kidnap specific individuals whose torture and execution would have maximum psychological impact on the remaining Dark Angels. These captives were then subjected to elaborate execution rituals that were broadcast directly to the enemy fleet, forcing the Dark Angels to witness the systematic degradation and murder of their battle brothers. The psychological impact on the Dark Angels was profound and lasting, creating trauma that would affect their combat performance for months afterward. But the true horror of these actions lay not in their immediate effects, but in the evident pleasure that the Night Lords took in conducting them. What had begun as tactical necessity had evolved into recreational sadism, with the VIII Legion Marines competing to devise increasingly creative methods of inflicting suffering on their captives. Lionel Johnson's response to these atrocities revealed both his tactical acumen and his fundamental inability to comprehend the enemy he was facing. The Lion attempted to counter the Night Lord's psychological warfare through conventional military excellence, believing that superior strategy and disciplined execution would eventually overcome his brother's unconventional methods. He failed to understand that Konrad was no longer fighting to achieve military victory, but to validate his dark philosophy about human nature and the inevitability of corruption. The campaign began to take on characteristics that transcended traditional warfare, becoming instead a philosophical debate conducted through violence and terror. Each engagement became an opportunity for both Primarchs to test their fundamental beliefs about leadership, loyalty, and the nature of justice. Where Lionel Johnson sought to demonstrate that discipline and honor could triumph over chaos and corruption, Konrad Curze was determined to prove that all such ideals were ultimately meaningless facades, concealing humanity's fundamental brutality. The turning point in the campaign came not through military action, but through a single act of profound significance that revealed the extent of Konrad's descent into nihilistic madness. During one of his prophetic visions, the Night Haunter witnessed the complete corruption of his homeworld Nostramo, seeing how thoroughly the criminal elements had reasserted their control in his absence, and how completely they had perverted the order he had worked so hard to establish. Rather than attempting to return to Nostramo to address these problems or implementing reforms to prevent future corruption, Konrad made a decision that shocked even his own subordinates in its scope and finality. He ordered the complete destruction of his homeworld, directing the VIII Legion's fleet to conduct a systematic orbital bombardment that would reduce the entire planet to lifeless rock. The decision to destroy Nostramo was presented to the Legion as a necessary strategic action, eliminating a corrupted recruiting base that was producing substandard Marines and compromising the VIII Legion's effectiveness. But the Night Lords who carried out the bombardment understood that this was something far more personal and disturbing, a rejection of his own origins so complete that it bordered on cosmic suicide. The bombardment of Nostramo took place over several days, with the Night Lords taking care to ensure that no significant population centers escaped destruction. The planet's cities, its industrial facilities, even the deep tunnel systems where Konrad had spent his early years, all were systematically obliterated by orbital weapons fire. Billions of human beings died in the bombardment, including many who had played no role in the corruption that had triggered Konrad's rage. The psychological impact of Nostramo's destruction on the VIII Legion was immediate and devastating. The Marines who had been recruited from that world found themselves literally without a home, their entire cultural identity erased by their own Primarch's decision. The Terran-born Marines who had never felt strong connections to Nostramo nonetheless understood that they had participated in an act of genocide that went far beyond military necessity. More importantly, Konrad's willingness to destroy his own homeworld demonstrated to his subordinates that no loyalty or connection was sacred, that even the most fundamental bonds could be severed if they conflicted with his vision of necessity. This realization created an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty within the Legion that made effective military coordination increasingly difficult. The destruction of Nostramo marked the beginning of the VIII Legion's fragmentation into the independent warbands that would characterize their post-heresy existence. Without a homeworld to provide cultural unity and a steady supply of recruits, the various companies and battalions began to develop their own distinct identities and objectives. Some remained focused on military goals related to the ongoing civil war, while others became increasingly obsessed with pursuing the terror tactics that had become their signature approach to warfare. Captain Jago Sevatarian, despite his unwavering personal loyalty to Konrad Curze, began to recognize that the Legion was dissolving as a coherent military force. His attempts to maintain unit discipline and strategic focus were undermined by the growing influence of Marines who saw the Civil War as an opportunity to indulge their darkest impulses without constraint or oversight. The careful balance between tactical necessity and systematic cruelty that had once defined the Night Lords was giving way to pure sadism that served no purpose beyond personal gratification. The final phases of the Thramas Crusade saw the Night Lords achieving their strategic objectives while simultaneously completing their transformation into something that could no longer be classified as a Space Marine Legion in any meaningful sense. They had become a collection of terror cults, united only by their shared allegiance to a Primarch who was himself descending into complete madness, pursuing goals that existed beyond conventional concepts of victory or defeat. The Siege of Terra represented the culmination of humanity's greatest civil war, but for Konrad Curze and the VIII Legion, it marked not a climactic battle, but rather the final confirmation of prophecies that had guided their actions for decades. The Night Haunter's participation in the siege was marked by a strange detachment from the grand strategic objectives that consumed other traitor forces, as if he were observing the fulfillment of inevitable fate rather than actively participating in its creation. Unlike the other traitor primarchs who threw themselves into the assault on the Imperial palace with desperate fury, Konrad approached the siege with the calculated precision of a surgeon performing a necessary but distasteful operation. His visions had shown him that Horus would ultimately fail in his attempt to overthrow the Emperor, that the rebellion would collapse in defeat and scatter its surviving participants across the galaxy. This foreknowledge freed him from the illusions of victory that drove his brothers, allowing him to focus on objectives that transcended the immediate conflict. The VIII Legion's role during the siege was primarily concentrated in the outer sectors of Terra's defense grid, where they were tasked with eliminating loyalist strongpoints that could threaten the main assault routes toward the Imperial palace. But their methods during these operations revealed how completely they had abandoned any pretense of fighting for the rebellion's stated goals, instead pursuing a private war against the concepts of hope and redemption that the Emperor's regime represented. Rather than conducting efficient military assaults designed to clear strategic objectives, the Night Lords implemented elaborate terror campaigns that seemed designed more to traumatize surviving witnesses than to achieve tactical advantages. Loyalist garrisons that might have been overwhelmed through conventional assault were instead subjected to prolonged psychological warfare that broke their will to resist, while simultaneously demonstrating the futility of faith in Imperial ideals. The siege's most revealing moment came when the VIII Legion was assigned to capture the Eternity Gate spaceport, a crucial facility that controlled access to the Imperial Palace's outer defenses. Standard military doctrine would have called for a swift assault to seize the facility before its defenders could organize effective resistance. Instead, Konrad ordered his forces to establish a complete perimeter around the spaceport and begin what he termed educational demonstrations for the benefit of the trapped defenders. These demonstrations consisted of elaborate torture sessions conducted in full view of the spaceport's defensive positions, using captured Imperial Guard personnel and civilian refugees as unwilling participants in displays designed to illustrate the consequences of continued resistance. The Night Lords had perfected techniques for prolonging their victims' suffering while keeping them conscious and aware, creating spectacles of human misery that were literally too horrifying for most observers to witness without psychological damage. The defenders of Eternity Gate spaceport found themselves trapped in an impossible situation where surrender offered no hope of mercy and continued resistance only prolonged the torment of their comrades. Many of the Imperial Guard units began to suffer complete psychological breakdowns as their soldiers were forced to watch friends and colleagues subjected to tortures that seemed to go on for days without respite. But the true horror of the situation lay in Konrad's stated objective for these demonstrations. He was not trying to capture the spaceport or eliminate its defensive capabilities, but rather to create what he called perfect understanding among the survivors about the true nature of the universe they inhabited. He wanted them to recognize that their faith in the Emperor's protection was a delusion, that their belief in human dignity and nobility was a fantasy that could not survive contact with reality. The siege of the spaceport continued for weeks longer than any military objective could justify, becoming instead a philosophical experiment conducted through systematic torture. Konrad personally oversaw many of the torture sessions, not because he took pleasure in the suffering, but because he believed he was providing an essential education about the fundamental characteristics of existence in a universe where mercy was weakness and compassion was fatal naivety. The psychological impact on the VIII Legion itself was profound and disturbing, revealing how completely their transformation into agents of pure malevolence had progressed. Marines who had once required justification and rational explanation for extreme measures now participated in systematic torture with an enthusiasm that bordered on religious fervor. They had internalized their primarch's nihilistic philosophy to such a degree that causing suffering had become not just tactically necessary, but morally imperative. Captain Jago Sevatarian, observing these developments with growing alarm, attempted to raise concerns about the Legion's trajectory during one of his regular meetings with Konrad. The first captain argued that their current methods were counterproductive from a military standpoint, that prolonged torture sessions were consuming resources and personnel that could be better employed in support of the rebellion's strategic objectives. Konrad's response revealed the extent of his disconnection from conventional military thinking, and his embrace of goals that existed beyond the immediate conflict. He explained to his first captain that military victory in the traditional sense was irrelevant because his visions had already shown him the ultimate outcome of the siege. The Emperor would survive, Horus would be defeated, and the traitor forces would be scattered into exile. Under these circumstances, the only meaningful objective was to ensure that the lessons learned during the siege would survive to influence humanity's future development. The Night Haunter's conception of these lessons was both chilling and logically consistent with his established worldview. He believed that the siege represented humanity's last opportunity to confront the truth about its own nature before retreating into the comforting delusions that had characterized the Great Crusade. The systematic torture and psychological warfare that the VIII Legion was conducting served as demonstrations of what humans were truly capable of when freed from the constraints of conventional morality. But even as he rationalized these actions as necessary education, Konrad was experiencing prophetic visions that revealed the personal cost of his philosophical commitment. He witnessed his own future death in vivid detail, seeing himself hunted across the galaxy by Imperial assassins until finally accepting execution as the logical conclusion of his life's work. These visions should have filled him with dread or motivated him to change course, but instead they seemed to provide a sense of completion and vindication. The final phase of the Siege of Terror saw the VIII Legion's participation become increasingly sporadic and unfocused as different companies and battalions began pursuing their own objectives rather than coordinating their actions according to overall strategic plans. The destruction of Nostramo had eliminated the cultural bonds that had once held the Legion together, and the prolonged exposure to systematic cruelty had eroded their capacity for effective military cooperation. Some Night Lords companies became obsessed with hunting specific types of victims, developing elaborate rituals around the capture and torture of Imperial civilians who met certain arbitrary criteria. Others focused on collecting trophies and artifacts that had no tactical value but served as souvenirs of their participation in humanity's greatest atrocity. Still others simply descended into random violence that served no purpose beyond personal gratification. Konrad himself seemed increasingly disinterested in maintaining control over his fragmenting legion, allowing individual commanders to interpret his orders according to their own understanding of his philosophy. This decentralized approach to command reflected his growing conviction that the VIII Legion's transformation into something beyond conventional military organization was not a failure, but an evolution toward their true purpose as agents of cosmic truth. The siege's climactic moments, when Horus finally breached the Imperial Palace's defenses and confronted the Emperor in single combat, found the Night Lords engaged in operations that had no connection to these pivotal events. They were scattered across Terra's surface, conducting individual terror campaigns that served no strategic purpose beyond the satisfaction of their own psychological needs. When news of Horus's defeat and death finally reached the scattered VIII Legion companies, their reactions reveal the full extent of their transformation from loyal space marines into something altogether more sinister. Rather than experiencing shock or despair at their cause's failure, many Night Lords seemed relieved that the pretense of serving larger objectives could finally be abandoned in favor of pursuing their true calling as agents of pure terror. The withdrawal from Terra that followed Horus's death was marked by a level of systematic destruction that went far beyond military necessity or even revenge. The Night Lords implemented what they termed educational vandalism, destroying not just strategic targets, but cultural institutions, historical monuments, and civilian infrastructure that had no military significance, but represented humanity's aspirations toward nobility and enlightenment. These final acts of destruction on Terra established the template that would guide Night Lords' operations for the next 10 millennia. They had evolved beyond the point where conventional concepts of victory and defeat held meaning, becoming instead a force that existed specifically to demonstrate the futility of hope and the inevitability of corruption. The siege had not ended their war against humanity's ideals, but simply changed the theater of operations from a single world to the entire galaxy. As the surviving traitor forces began their long retreat toward the Eye of Terror, Konrad Curze found himself leading a legion that bore little resemblance to the disciplined military organization he had inherited from the Emperor. The VIII Legion had become a collection of terror cults, united only by their shared commitment to proving that the universe was fundamentally hostile to human happiness, and that all attempts to create lasting peace or justice were doomed to failure. But this transformation, rather than representing a defeat of his vision, seemed to vindicate everything Konrad had believed about human nature and cosmic destiny. The Night Lords had become perfect expressions of the truth he had been trying to teach since his earliest days on Nostramo, living proof that darkness was stronger than light and that fear was more reliable than love. The final battle had not been lost but won, though the victory looked nothing like what anyone else would recognize as success. The defeat of Horus and the subsequent collapse of the rebellion left the surviving traitor forces scattered across the galaxy like fragments of a shattered mirror, each piece reflecting a different aspect of the catastrophe that had nearly destroyed human civilization. For the Night Lords, this period of immediate aftermath represented both liberation and dissolution, as the external constraints that had held their fragmenting legion together finally disappeared entirely. Unlike the other traitor legions, who fled toward the Eye of Terror, seeking refuge in the warp's chaotic embrace, the Eighth Legion's response to defeat was characteristically unconventional. Many companies and individual warbands simply vanished into the galaxy's dark corners, abandoning any pretense of coordinated action in favor of pursuing their own interpretations of the terror doctrine that had become their defining characteristic. Konrad Curze's reaction to the rebellion's failure was marked by a strange sense of satisfaction rather than disappointment or rage. His prophetic visions had prepared him for this outcome decades in advance, and the actual experience of defeat served primarily to confirm his fatalistic worldview about the inevitability of certain cosmic patterns. The Night Haunter had never truly believed that Horus could succeed in overthrowing the Emperor, viewing the entire civil war as an elaborate demonstration of humanity's capacity for self-destruction rather than a genuine attempt at revolutionary change. This philosophical detachment allowed Konrad to approach the post-heresy period with a clarity of purpose that eluded other traitor primarchs who were struggling to come to terms with their defeat. While Angron raged against his fate and Magnus retreated into arcane studies, the Night Haunter began methodically preparing for what he saw as the next phase of his mission to educate humanity about its own fundamental nature. The first major decision facing the scattered Night Lords was whether to attempt rebuilding their legion as a unified military force or to accept their fragmentation as a permanent condition that might actually serve their purposes more effectively. Different faction leaders within the Eighth Legion held radically different views on this question, leading to internal conflicts that further accelerated their dissolution into independent warbands. Captain Jago Sevatarian, despite his unwavering loyalty to Konrad personally, argued that maintaining some degree of organizational structure was essential for the Legion's long-term survival. He proposed establishing hidden bases throughout the galaxy where Night Lords' forces could regroup, re-equip, and plan coordinated operations against Imperial targets. This approach would preserve their effectiveness as a military force while allowing them to adapt to their new status as hunted fugitives. Other senior officers, particularly those who had been most deeply affected by the Legion's transformation during the siege, advocated for complete decentralization as the optimal approach to their new circumstances. They argued that small independent warbands would be far more difficult for Imperial forces to track and eliminate, while simultaneously allowing each group to develop its own unique interpretation of the terror tactics that had become their signature methodology. Captain Talos Valkyran of the 10th Company represented a third faction that sought to preserve some connection to the Legion's original purpose. While adapting to their changed circumstances, he proposed that the Night Lords should focus their efforts on hunting down and eliminating specific categories of Imperial personnel, particularly those whose actions had contributed to the corruption and moral compromise that characterized the post-heresy Imperium. These internal debates revealed fundamental philosophical differences about the Night Lords' identity and mission that had been developing throughout their descent into systematic terrorism, The Legion's transformation had been so complete that its surviving members could no longer agree on basic questions about their purpose, methods, or ultimate objectives. Konrad's response to these disagreements was characteristically indirect and prophetic. Rather than imposing a single organizational structure on his fragmenting legion, he allowed different factions to pursue their preferred approaches while providing cryptic guidance based on his visions of future events. He seemed to understand that the Night Lords' fragmentation was not a failure, but an evolution toward a form that would be better suited to the galaxy they would inhabit during the coming millennia. The practical challenges facing the dispersed Night Lords during this period were immense and multifaceted. They had lost access to the industrial infrastructure and recruitment networks that had sustained them during the Great Crusade, forcing them to develop entirely new methods for maintaining their equipment and replacing their casualties. The destruction of Nostramo had eliminated their primary source of new recruits, creating a demographic crisis that threatened their long-term viability as a military force. Some warbands attempted to solve these problems by establishing hidden bases on worlds that had remained outside Imperial control during the heresy. These facilities were designed not just as military strongholds, but as centers for the systematic indoctrination of new recruits drawn from local populations. The Night Lords developed sophisticated techniques for identifying individuals with the psychological characteristics necessary to serve their purposes, focusing particularly on survivors of traumatic experiences who had already been conditioned to understand the universe's fundamental hostility. Other warbands chose to embrace a more nomadic existence, operating from fleets of stolen or captured vessels that allowed them to move freely throughout the galaxy without being tied to any specific location. These mobile forces specialized in lightning raids against Imperial shipping and isolated outposts, using their superior mobility to strike without warning before disappearing back into the void. The early post-heresy period also saw the Night Lords developing new relationships with other forces that operated outside Imperial authority. Some warbands formed temporary alliances with pirate fleets and smuggling organizations, providing military expertise in exchange for resources and intelligence about Imperial activities. Others established connections with chaos cults and renegade populations that could serve as sources of recruits and material support. But perhaps, most significantly, the Night Lords began to discover that their reputation for systematic terror had become a weapon in its own right, often more effective than their actual military capabilities. Imperial worlds that detected signs of Night Lords' activity would sometimes surrender or abandon their positions without offering resistance, their populations paralyzed by fear of the fate that awaited them if they chose to fight. This psychological effect was deliberately cultivated and enhanced through carefully orchestrated terror campaigns that emphasized spectacle and symbolism over immediate tactical objectives. Night Lords' warbands would conduct elaborate raids designed primarily to create memorable atrocities that would be reported throughout the surrounding systems, spreading fear far beyond their actual area of operations. The development of these terror tactics marked the beginning of what would become the Night Lords' signature approach to warfare during their exile. They learned to use fear as both weapon and tool, understanding that the threat of their presence could be more valuable than their actual intervention in many situations. This approach allowed relatively small warbands to exert influence over vast regions of space through careful management of their reputation and strategic deployment of symbolic violence. Captain Sevatar, during one of the last recorded conferences between senior Night Lords officers, articulated what would become the philosophical foundation for their post-heresy existence. He argued that the Legion's fragmentation into independent warbands was not a sign of weakness, but a form of evolutionary adaptation that made them ideally suited to their new role as the galaxy's permanent reminder of humanity's capacity for evil. The conference, held aboard a captured Imperial cruiser somewhere in the outer reaches of Segmentum Solar, brought together representatives from dozens of different Night Lords factions to discuss their common future. The diversity of approaches and philosophies represented at this gathering illustrated how completely the Legion's original unity had dissolved, but it also revealed the emergence of new forms of cooperation based on shared commitment to their dark mission. The decisions made during this conference would shape Night Lords' operations for the next several millennia, establishing protocols for communication between independent warbands and creating frameworks for temporary alliances when larger operations required coordinated action. Most importantly, the conference formalized the Night Lords' abandonment of any pretense of serving chaos as a religious or ideological force, instead embracing their role as pure agents of terror who existed beyond conventional categories of loyalty or belief. As the immediate aftermath of the heresy gradually gave way to the longer-term consequences of their defeat, the Night Lords found themselves paradoxically more free to pursue their true calling than they had been during the height of their power. The collapse of external authority and organizational structure had liberated them from constraints that had limited their effectiveness as agents of psychological warfare, allowing each warband to develop its own unique approach to the systematic cultivation of fear. The stage was set for 10 millennia of raids, terror campaigns, and psychological warfare that would make the Night Lords name synonymous with humanity's darkest impulses. They had survived their apparent defeat by transforming it into a different kind of victory, proving that sometimes the most effective way to win a war is to change the definition of what victory looks like. 10 millennia have passed since the Night Lords scattered into the galaxy's shadows following the collapse of the Horus Heresy, yet their influence on Imperial society continues to grow like a malignant tumor that spreads through the collective consciousness of humanity. The warbands that emerged from the VIII Legion's fragmentation have evolved into something unprecedented in galactic history, a force that exists specifically to demonstrate the futility of hope and the inevitability of corruption through the systematic application of terror. The most profound consequence of the Night Lords' post-heresy evolution has been their transformation of fear itself into a strategic resource that can be harvested, refined, and deployed with scientific precision. Unlike other Chaos Space Marine warbands that pursue conquest or religious objectives, the Night Lords have developed an approach to warfare that treats psychological trauma as both means and end, creating self-sustaining campaigns of terror that continue to influence target populations long after the original perpetrators have moved on to other hunting grounds. This systematic approach to fear cultivation has produced effects that ripple across entire sectors of Imperial space, creating regions where the mere possibility of Night Lords activity has fundamentally altered how civilian populations, military forces, and governmental institutions operate. Worlds that have never actually encountered the VIII Legion's successors nonetheless implement security protocols and behavioral restrictions based on horror stories and cautionary tales that have been passed down through generations of terrified survivors. The Night Lord's most significant innovation during this period has been the development of what Imperial scholars refer to as inherited terror, psychological conditioning that passes from generation to generation through cultural transmission rather than direct experience. Children on worlds that were attacked by Night Lords centuries ago still grow up hearing stories about the pale figures who emerge from darkness to punish the guilty and innocent alike, creating adult populations that are predisposed to submission and despair, even when facing conventional threats. This cultural inheritance has proven remarkably persistent and adaptive, evolving to incorporate local traditions and belief systems while maintaining its essential characteristics of fatalism and learned helplessness. Imperial missionaries attempting to counter these influences often find that their messages of hope and redemption are dismissed as dangerous delusions that will inevitably attract the attention of forces too terrible to confront directly. The fragmentation of the original VIII Legion into hundreds of independent warbands has allowed the Night Lords to experiment with different approaches to terror warfare, creating a diversity of methods and philosophies that makes them far more dangerous than they would have been as a unified force. Each warband has developed its own signature techniques and preferred victim categories, but all share a common commitment to the principle that fear is the most reliable tool for revealing human nature's fundamental characteristics. Some warbands specialize in what they term precision terror, carefully orchestrated campaigns that target specific individuals or institutions whose elimination will produce maximum psychological impact on surrounding populations. These operations often involve months or years of preparation, with Night Lords operatives studying their targets' personal histories, psychological vulnerabilities, and social connections to craft torture sessions that will traumatize witnesses in precisely calculated ways. Other warbands pursue cascade terror, strategies designed to trigger psychological breakdown across entire planetary populations through carefully timed atrocities that overwhelm local authorities' ability to maintain order. These campaigns typically begin with seemingly random attacks that create an atmosphere of paranoia and suspicion, then escalate through increasingly dramatic displays of violence that demonstrate the futility of resistance or flight. The most disturbing development has been the emergence of warbands that practice educational terror, systematic programs designed to teach victim populations specific lessons about human nature and cosmic reality. These operations often involve the establishment of temporary bases on target worlds where captured civilians can be subjected to elaborate torture regimens intended to demonstrate various philosophical principles about suffering, survival, and moral compromise. The Night Lords' technological capabilities have evolved significantly during their millennia of exile, driven primarily by necessity rather than innovation. Cut off from the industrial infrastructure that supported them during the Great Crusade, The various warbands have learned to maintain their equipment through scavenging, theft, and limited manufacturing operations conducted aboard their fleet vessels or in hidden bases scattered throughout the galaxy's frontier regions. Their approach to technology reflects their overall philosophy about the universe's fundamental characteristics, emphasizing reliability and terror value over sophisticated performance or aesthetic considerations. Night Lord's equipment is typically modified to maximize its psychological impact on enemies and victims, with weapons designed to produce distinctive sounds and visual effects that enhance their reputation for supernatural menace. The warbands have also developed sophisticated intelligence networks that allow them to track Imperial activities across vast regions of space, despite their limited resources and manpower. These networks rely heavily on fear-based cooperation from civilian populations who provide information about Imperial troop movements, supply shipments, and security arrangements in exchange for promises of protection from Night Lords' attention. More troubling from the Imperial perspective is the Night Lords' apparent ability to predict and counter government responses to their activities, suggesting access to intelligence sources within the Imperial hierarchy itself. Some Inquisition reports suggest that certain Night Lords' warbands have cultivated relationships with corrupt officials who provide advance warning of military operations in exchange for immunity from attack or other considerations. The recruitment methods employed by different Night Lords' warbands have evolved to reflect local conditions and cultural characteristics, but all share a common emphasis on identifying individuals who possess the psychological traits necessary for effective terror warfare. Potential recruits are typically selected from populations that have already experienced significant trauma, as these individuals have demonstrated the resilience necessary to survive the enhancement process while retaining the capacity for empathy that makes them effective torturers. The indoctrination process used to transform recruits into full Night Lords varies between warbands, but universally involves systematic exposure to extreme violence designed to erode conventional moral inhibitions while building new behavioral patterns based on fear and dominance. This process is deliberately traumatic and frequently fatal, but those who survive emerge as individuals who have internalized the Night Lord's nihilistic philosophy so completely that causing suffering becomes not just acceptable, but psychologically necessary. Perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of the Night Lords' activities has been their influence on Imperial military doctrine and civilian governance policies. The constant threat of terror attacks has led to the implementation of security measures that fundamentally alter the relationship between Imperial authorities and the populations they govern, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and control that serves the Night Lords' objectives even in their absence. Imperial Guard regiments operating in regions known to be active Night Lords' hunting grounds have developed tactical doctrines that emphasize psychological resilience and unit cohesion over conventional military effectiveness. These adaptations often prove counterproductive when facing conventional enemies, but they represent necessary survival strategies for forces that might encounter opponents capable of breaking their will to fight through psychological warfare alone. Civilian populations in affected regions have similarly adapted their social structures and cultural practices to minimize their vulnerability to terror attacks, creating societies that are often more repressive and paranoid than necessary for their actual security needs. These adaptations frequently persist long after the original threat has moved on, creating permanent changes in local culture that serve the Night Lords' broader objectives of demonstrating humanity's tendency toward authoritarianism and mutual suspicion. The Adeptus Arbites and other imperial law enforcement agencies have been forced to develop specialized protocols for investigating Night Lords' activities, recognizing that conventional criminal investigation techniques are inadequate for addressing crimes specifically designed to traumatize investigators and witnesses. These protocols often involve isolation and psychological conditioning for personnel assigned to such cases, creating an institutionalized acknowledgement that exposure to Night Lords' activities produces lasting psychological damage even among trained professionals. The ecclesiarchy's response to Night Lords' influence has been similarly adaptive, developing new theological frameworks for explaining suffering and evil that attempt to counter the nihilistic philosophy that the VIII Legion's successors promote through their actions. These efforts have achieved mixed results, often providing comfort to victims while simultaneously validating some of the Night Lords' claims about human nature and cosmic justice. The cumulative effect of 10 millennia of Night Lords' activity has been the creation of a galaxy where fear has become a permanent feature of human existence, influencing decisions and behaviors at every level of Imperial society. Their success in this endeavor represents perhaps the most complete victory achieved by any of the traitor forces, as they have fundamentally altered the psychological landscape of human civilization without requiring conquest or direct control of territory. The Night Lords have proven that terror, properly applied and sustained over sufficient time periods, can become a self-perpetuating force that continues to influence human behavior long after its original source has been forgotten or destroyed. They have made fear itself into a weapon of mass destruction that targets the human spirit rather than physical infrastructure, creating wounds that can be passed down through generations like a genetic inheritance. In the dying light of the 41st millennium, as humanity teeters on the precipice of extinction while facing threats that eclipse even the darkest days of the Age of Strife, the Night Lords endure as living monuments to prophecy fulfilled. The scattered inheritors of Konrad Curze's legacy have transcended their origins as space marines to become something far more insidious and enduring. They are the galaxy's memory of its own capacity for evil, patient gardeners tending crops of fear that have been growing for 10,000 years. The modern Night Lords operate in a galaxy that has validated every aspect of their primarch's pessimistic worldview. The Imperium of the 42nd millennium bears little resemblance to the idealistic civilization envisioned during the Great Crusade, having evolved into exactly the kind of paranoid, oppressive, and self-destructive society that Konrad Curze predicted would emerge from humanity's fundamental nature. In this environment, the Night Lords find themselves not as rebels against civilization, but as its most honest representatives, embodying truths that others refuse to acknowledge. Current estimates suggest that approximately 60 distinct Night Lords warbands remain active throughout Imperial space, though this number represents only those groups that have been positively identified through their activities. The true scope of their influence extends far beyond direct military action, encompassing networks of fear, corruption, and psychological conditioning that have become integral to the functioning of Imperial society itself. The Red Corsairs Night Lords, auxiliary units, operate throughout the Maelstrom Zone, specializing in precision strikes against Imperial shipping convoys. Their methods have evolved beyond simple piracy to encompass elaborate psychological campaigns that leave survivor populations traumatized in specific ways, designed to maximize the spread of terror through word-of-mouth accounts. These operations demonstrate the sophisticated understanding of human psychology that has become the Night Lord's most distinctive characteristic. The Bleeding Eyes warband has established a territory spanning several systems in Segmentum Solar's outer reaches, where they conduct systematic hunts against Imperial nobility. Their approach involves months of psychological preparation, designed to break their target's will to resist while simultaneously educating them about their own moral failures and hypocrisies. The warband's leader, a former captain named X-Arl, claims to be carrying out Konrad Curze's final judgments against those who embody the corruption that destroyed the Imperium's original promise. The Screaming Gallery operates from hidden bases within the Ghoul Stars, emerging periodically to conduct terror campaigns that seem designed more to test psychological theories than to achieve traditional military objectives. Their activities include systematic studies of how different human populations respond to various forms of trauma, with results carefully documented and shared with other Night Lords groups through methods that Imperial intelligence has been unable to penetrate. Perhaps most disturbing is the emergence of the Pale Nomads, a warband that appears to consist entirely of Marines who claim direct descent from Konrad Curze himself. These individuals display abilities that echo their Primarch's prophetic gifts, demonstrating uncanny knowledge of future events and an ability to anticipate Imperial responses that borders on the supernatural. Their leader, known only as the Night Prophet, has issued proclamations suggesting that Konrad Curze's death was merely another layer of deception in a plan that spans millennia. The coordination between these disparate groups continues to baffle Imperial analysts, who have documented simultaneous operations conducted across vast distances with precision that suggests central planning despite the absence of any detectable command structure. Some Inquisitors theorize that the Night Lords have developed a form of collective consciousness based on shared trauma and philosophical alignment, while others propose more mundane explanations involving hidden communication networks or sleeper agents within Imperial institutions. Recent intelligence reports from the Indomitus Crusade indicate that Night Lords' activities have intensified in response to rowboat Guilliman's return, and the renewed hope his presence has inspired among Imperial populations. Their operations seem specifically designed to counter the optimism that the returned Primarch represents, employing terror tactics that target not just individuals, but the very concept of redemption and renewal that Guilliman embodies. The methods employed in these campaigns demonstrate evolution and adaptation that suggests the Night Lords have learned from 10 millennia of experience in psychological warfare. They have developed techniques for identifying and exploiting specific psychological vulnerabilities within populations that have been conditioned by Imperial propaganda to believe in eventual salvation. Their success in breaking this conditioning reveals a sophisticated understanding of human nature that goes far beyond simple brutality. The Night Lord's influence on contemporary Imperial culture extends into areas that most citizens never consciously recognize. The pervasive atmosphere of fear and suspicion that characterizes daily life in the 41st millennium reflects psychological conditioning that has been shaped by generations of terror campaigns. Children grow up learning to fear the dark, not because of natural human instincts, but because of cultural memories of pale figures who emerge from shadows to punish the guilty and innocent alike. Educational systems throughout Imperial space incorporate warnings about the dangers of hope and optimism, teaching young people that excessive confidence in the future will inevitably attract the attention of forces beyond human comprehension. These lessons, presented as practical wisdom about surviving in a hostile universe, actually serve to perpetuate the psychological conditions that make populations vulnerable to Night Lords' influence. The Adeptus Mechanicus has reported unusual patterns in their data analysis systems when processing information related to Night Lords' activities. The machine spirits that serve the Omnissiah seem to experience something analogous to fear when tasked with calculating probabilities involving terror campaigns, producing results that suggest the Night Lord's influence extends even into the realm of artificial intelligence and machine consciousness. Military doctrine throughout the Imperial Guard has evolved to incorporate assumptions about human behavior under extreme stress that align perfectly with Night Lord's philosophy. Training regimens emphasize the importance of fear as a motivating force, while acknowledging that most humans will choose survival over honor when faced with sufficient psychological pressure. These adaptations, justified as realistic preparation for combat conditions, actually serve to validate the fundamental premises underlying Night Lord's terror tactics. The ecclesiarchy's response to 10 millennia of Night Lord's influence has produced theological innovations that would have been considered heretical during earlier periods of Imperial history. Modern Imperial doctrine explicitly acknowledges the necessity of fear and suffering as components of human spiritual development, incorporating prayers and rituals that celebrate humanity's capacity to endure trauma rather than its potential for transcendence. Saint Euphratikila's revised teachings, which have become orthodox throughout much of Imperial space, include specific warnings about the dangers of excessive hope and the spiritual value of despair as a tool for understanding human limitations. These doctrines serve Night Lords' objectives by creating populations that are psychologically predisposed to accept terror and suffering as natural and necessary aspects of existence. The Death Watch maintains extensive archives documenting Night Lords' methods and capabilities, but access to these materials requires psychological screening and conditioning designed to prevent contamination through exposure to terror tactics. Several battle brothers assigned to anti-Night Lords operations have requested reassignment after experiencing what they describe as prophetic dreams that echo Konrad Curze's visions of inevitable doom and corruption. Chapter Master Artemis of the Death Watch has issued classified reports suggesting that prolonged exposure to Night Lords' activities produces changes in Space Marine psychology that mirror some aspects of the VIII Legion's original transformation. Veterans of terror campaign investigations display increased cynicism about human nature and tendency to employ harsh methods against civilian populations, raising concerns about the long-term effects of fighting enemies who wage war primarily through psychological corruption. The question of Konrad Curze's ultimate fate has gained renewed relevance in light of recent sightings of a pale figure matching the Night Haunter's description in systems experiencing particularly sophisticated terror campaigns. While official Imperial records confirm his death at the hands of the Kalidas assassin Moajan, some Inquisition factions have begun to question whether the being who died was actually the Primarch or merely another layer of deception in a plan that spans millennia. These theories gain credibility when considering the prophetic abilities that Konrad possessed during his lifetime and his demonstrated capacity for long-term strategic planning that accounted for events decades in the future. The possibility that he foresaw and prepared for his own apparent death, perhaps arranging for his resurrection or continuation through other means, represents a threat assessment challenge that Imperial authorities are ill-equipped to address. The Night Lords' ultimate achievement lies not in any military victory or territorial conquest, but in their success at making fear into a fundamental component of human civilization. They have proven that terror, properly applied and sustained over sufficient time periods, can become a self-perpetuating force that shapes cultural development across millennia. Their philosophy about human nature has become a self-fulfilling prophecy that influences every aspect of Imperial society. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and the laughter of thirsting gods, the Night Lords serve as humanity's mirror, reflecting back the darkness that lies beneath civilization's carefully maintained facade. They have become the galaxy's conscience, the voice that whispers uncomfortable truths about what humans become when all pretense of nobility is stripped away. The Imperium of the 41st millennium stands as monument to Konrad Curze's vision, a civilization built on fear and maintained through systematic oppression that validates every prediction the Night Haunter made about humanity's inevitable corruption. In achieving this transformation, the Night Lords have won the most complete victory possible, proving that sometimes the monsters are right about the nature of the universe and the creatures that inhabit it. As the galaxy burns and ancient horrors stir in the void between stars, the Night Lords continue their eternal vigil as guardians of humanity's darkest truths. They are the night that never ends, the fear that never dies, the proof that some wounds never heal, and some corruption can never be cleansed. They have made themselves into the galaxy's permanent reminder that in the end the darkness always wins, because it was there first and will be there last, patient and eternal as the void itself.